Before we begin the horror show, tell me where you're from. Drop your city name in the comments, and if there's a creepy story tied to it, I'll make sure to feature it in a future video. Your city's frightful past could be the next to terrorize us all. These are not just campfire tales. These are chilling, real-life encounters that will make you think twice before setting foot on a mountain trail. Welcome to 5 real creepy mountain horror encounters. Dare to watch till the end? The mountains are calling, but you may not like what answers. Story number 1. The mountain stood like a titan on the horizon, its jagged peaks clawing at the heavens. Whispering Summit, as it was known by locals, was a place of legends and fear, a destination for the daring and the foolhardy. Tales of unnatural winds and ghostly echoes had circulated for centuries, but that didn't deter the group of 5 friends eager for adventure. For Aiden, the ambitious leader of the group, this climb was more than a challenge. It was a way to prove himself. He had organized every detail, planned every step, and promised his friends an experience they'd never forget. Mia, the quiet observer, had hesitated when Aiden first pitched the idea. There was something about the mountain's towering presence in the photographs that unsettled her, but she didn't want to be the only one to back out. Noah, the joker of the group, saw it as an opportunity to create endless content for his social media feed. #Summit Life, he had said, grinning. Rachel, always with a camera in hand, was there for the breathtaking views and the hope of capturing something extraordinary. Ethan, ever the skeptic, had joined reluctantly. His practical mind dismissed the legends as nothing more than superstitions. "It's just a mountain," he had said. "What's the worst that could happen?" They arrived at the base of the Whispering Summit as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden sign, its letters faded but still legible. "Enter at your own risk." "Cheesy," Noah remarked, snapping a selfie with the sign. Aiden smirked. "It's all part of the experience." But as they began their ascent, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The climb had been grueling. The air thinned as they ascended, each step requiring more effort than the last. By the time they reached the summit, the sun was setting, casting the landscape in a surreal, golden glow. "Guys," Rachel said breathlessly, pointing her camera at the horizon. This is unreal." The view was, indeed, breathtaking. Miles of untouched wilderness stretched out below them, the jagged peaks of neighboring mountains piercing through a sea of clouds. The world felt distant, insignificant. "We made it," Aiden said, dropping his backpack and raising his arms in triumph. Mia, however, remained quiet. Her gaze was fixed on the rocks surrounding them, their surfaces worn smooth by time, but oddly unnatural in their arrangement. "This place feels strange," she muttered. "Strange how?" Ethan asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "I don't know, just off," Mia replied, shaking her head as if trying to dismiss her own unease. Noah laughed. "It's a mountaintop, Mia. What did you expect? A Starbucks?" But even Noah's usual humor couldn't dispel the growing tension. As they began setting up their tents, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made them all pause. It was faint at first, barely discernible, a low murmur that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Aiden said, though his own movements had stilled. "The wind," Rachel said nervously. "It sounded weird." Ethan rolled his eyes. "It's just air moving through the rocks. You're all jumping at shadows." But as they worked, the murmurs grew louder, taking on an eerie, rhythmic quality. It wasn't the random rustling of leaves or the howl of the wind. It was deliberate. By the time night fell, the whispers were undeniable. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, echoing off the rocks and lingering in the air. The group gathered around the campfire, their faces illuminated by its flickering light. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Rachel said, clutching her camera like a talisman. Noah tried to make a joke, but even he couldn't muster his usual bravado. "Maybe the mountain's haunted," he said, forcing a grin. Aiden poked at the fire, his jaw set. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's get some sleep. We've got a long hike down tomorrow." Reluctantly, they retreated to their tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Mia lay awake, staring at the fabric ceiling of her tent, her heart pounding in time with the whispers. They were louder now, almost as if they were inside her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing them to stop. And then she heard it, a faint, distinct voice among the murmurs, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Mia! Her breath caught in her throat. The voice had said her name. Bolting upright, she unzipped her tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow on the surrounding rocks. Hello, she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispers, louder now, almost deafening. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the darkness. And then she saw it, a shadow, human-like in shape, standing just beyond the firelight. Mia, what are you doing? She spun around to see Aiden stepping out of his tent, his face pale and drawn. Did you hear it? She whispered. Hear what? Aiden asked, though his wide eyes told her he had heard it too. Before she could answer, the shadow moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided, its movements unnatural and deliberate. Aiden grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her back toward the tents. We're staying together, he said firmly. But even as they retreated, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. And in the distance, the shadow watched. The night grew colder as the whispers intensified, seeping into the air like an otherworldly fog. Aiden and Mia huddled near the fire's dying embers, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The others slowly emerged from their tents, drawn by the sound that now seemed to fill every crevice of the summit. What's going on? Rachel asked, clutching her jacket tightly. Her voice was barely audible over the cacophony of whispers, which now seemed to carry an unsettling rhythm, almost like chanting. There's something out there, Mia said, her eyes darting toward the shadows beyond the firelight. Ethan frowned, his skepticism waning as he glanced around. It's just the wind, he started, but his voice faltered when he noticed the strange, gliding figure in the distance. Rachel pointed, her hand trembling. Do you see that? Noah squinted into the darkness, his usual smirk replaced by a look of genuine fear. What the hell is that? The shadowy figure stood motionless now, as if watching them. It had no discernible features, no face, yet its presence was suffocating. It wasn't just the figure. The rocks themselves seemed to shift subtly in the dim light, their edges warping and curling as though the mountain itself were alive. Everyone, stay together, Aiden commanded, his voice steady but tense. He grabbed a flashlight from his backpack and shone it toward the figure. The beam of light hit the shadow, but instead of illuminating it, the light seemed to dissolve, swallowed by the darkness surrounding the figure. It didn't react, didn't move, until the whispers abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. The group froze, their breaths the only sound. What happened? Rachel whispered, breaking the stillness. Before anyone could answer, the figure moved again, gliding closer. Its movement was unnatural, almost as if it were sliding through reality itself. Aiden raised the flashlight again, his hand shaking. We need to leave, now. Leave? In the middle of the night, Ethan snapped, though his usual confidence had drained from his voice. Do you have any idea how dangerous it is to hike down in the dark? More dangerous than this? Mia shot back, pointing toward the approaching figure. The whispers returned, louder now, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. This time they weren't just noise, they were words, phrases, though in a language no one could understand. Can you hear them? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. They're speaking, Noah muttered, clutching his head. It's like they're inside my brain. The group instinctively huddled closer, their fear palpable. The fire flickered weakly, its light shrinking as though being consumed by the darkness. And then they saw it. Etched into the ground around their campsite, lines began to form. At first they seemed like cracks in the dirt, but as they expanded they connected into intricate patterns, glowing faintly with an unnatural, sickly light. What the hell is this? Ethan exclaimed, stepping back. Rachel aimed her camera at the ground, the lens shaking as she captured the bizarre markings. It's some kind of symbol, she stammered. A ritual, maybe. The shadow figure stopped at the edge of the glowing patterns, its formless body towering over the group. The whispers grew louder, almost unbearable now, like a pressure pushing down on their skulls. "We're being surrounded," Aiden said, his voice barely audible over the noise. As if in response, the patterns began to pulse, their light growing brighter with each beat, like the rhythm of a massive, living heart. And then the ground began to quake. The first victim. The tremors threw them off balance, and Rachel screamed as her camera slipped from her grasp and shattered against a rock. "We have to go," Aiden yelled, grabbing his backpack and motioning for the others to follow. But the ground shifted beneath their feet, the glowing symbols expanding and warping as though the mountain itself were alive. Rocks jutted upward, forming jagged barriers that cut off their escape routes. "Over here!" Mia shouted, pointing toward a narrow gap between the rocks. They ran, the whispers now accompanied by a deep, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the very core of the mountain. Noah was the last to move, his eyes darting back to the shadow figure, which now seemed to split into multiple forms, each one gliding in a different direction. "They're multiplying!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. As they squeezed through the gap, Ethan stumbled, his foot catching on a loose rock. He fell hard, and before anyone could react, one of the shadow figures was upon him. "Ethan!" Mia screamed, reaching out to him. The figure didn't attack in a conventional sense. It enveloped him, its form shifting and twisting around his body. Ethan's screams were muffled as he was consumed, his limbs jerking violently before going still. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadow receded, leaving nothing behind but a dark, viscous stain on the ground where Ethan had been. "Oh my God," Rachel whispered, her face pale. "We have to keep moving," Aiden said, his voice hard. "We can't help him now." But the group's morale was shattered. Noah clutched his head, muttering incoherently as the whispers grew louder. Rachel was on the verge of tears, her hands trembling as she followed Aiden and Mia. And all the while, the shadows closed in, their movements deliberate and menacing. The mountain was alive, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The remaining four pressed forward, their breaths labored as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The glowing patterns continued to pulse beneath their feet, the whispers escalating into a symphony of torment. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to the heart of the mountain, and deeper into its clutches. Aiden led the way, his flashlight flickering ominously, as though struggling against the oppressive darkness. Mia stayed close to him, her eyes darting to every shadow that flickered in the corner of her vision. Rachel lagged behind, clutching her injured arm from where a jagged rock had grazed her. But Noah, he was the worst off. He staggered as he walked, his head twitching as though trying to shake something out of his mind. He muttered nonsensical phrases under his breath, his hands pressed against his ears. "They're in my head," he kept repeating, his voice a whisper. "They're in my head. I can hear them." "Noah, stay with us," Mia said, her voice soft but firm. "They're telling me things," he said, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They're showing me the truth." "What truth?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. Noah didn't respond. Instead, he stopped in his tracks, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "Do you see it?" he asked, pointing a trembling finger. The group turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of jagged rocks and shifting shadows. "There's nothing, Noah," Aiden said, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. "You need to keep moving." But Noah resisted, wrenching his arm free. "No, you don't understand. It's calling me. I have to go." Before anyone could stop him, Noah broke into a run, his movements erratic as he scrambled over the rocks. "Noah, wait!" Mia shouted, but he was already too far ahead. Aiden cursed under his breath and sprinted after him, the others following close behind. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each step, now forming fragmented sentences in a language that was both alien and familiar. Noah stopped abruptly at the edge of a cliff, his silhouette framed against the faint, eerie glow of the symbols on the ground. He turned to face the group, his face contorted with a mixture of terror and elation. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Noah, step away from the edge," Aiden said, his voice calm but urgent. "They want me to join them," Noah continued, his voice distant. "They said I'll be free." "Noah, please," Mia begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this." But it was too late. With a final haunting smile, Noah stepped backward and disappeared over the edge. Mia screamed, rushing to the cliff, but Aiden held her back. "Don't look," he said firmly. The whispers faded momentarily, replaced by an eerie silence. The group stood frozen, the reality of their loss sinking in. But the silence didn't last long. From the depths below, a guttural roar echoed, shaking the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't just the mountain, it was something inside it, something alive and ancient. "We need to move," Aiden said, his voice grim. "Now!" The fire crackled weakly as the hikers sat in strained silence. Every flicker of flame cast distorted shadows across their faces, emphasizing the growing tension in the air. No one spoke of the whispers, but each of them could feel it, a strange, insidious energy seeping into their thoughts. Above, the night sky stretched infinitely, but even the stars seemed colder and further away, as if the mountain had isolated them from the universe itself. It was Emma who broke the silence, her voice trembling as she stared at the jagged peak silhouetted against the dark sky. "We shouldn't have come here," she whispered, clutching her arms tightly. "This place, it's wrong. It feels alive." "Enough of this paranoia," snapped Ian, his eyes bloodshot and darting between the others. "You're just scaring yourself. We're tired, that's all. We need to get some sleep and clear our heads." But Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "Sleep?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can you sleep when the mountain is talking to us? Those whispers, Ian, they're not in my head. They're real." "Enough," Ian barked, his voice echoing unnaturally in the still air. He stood abruptly, towering over the others. "We're just tired. No one's talking to us. We're letting our imaginations get the better of us. Let's get some rest and move out at first light." Emma's lips quivered as she glanced at Mark, hoping for reassurance. But Mark remained silent, staring into the dying fire. His hands fidgeted with the edges of his jacket, but he made no attempt to speak. It was as if he had already resigned himself to whatever fate awaited them. As the others reluctantly prepared to sleep, Emma kept her gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had merely grown softer, subtler, weaving themselves into the rhythm of the wind. She swore she could hear her name among the murmurs, faint and seductive, calling her toward the summit. The night was far from peaceful. The hiker's sleep was plagued by vivid, unsettling dreams. Emma dreamt of standing alone on the summit, surrounded by towering stone faces carved into the mountain itself. The faces had eyes that bled black tears, and their mouths stretched open in silent screams. She could feel their despair, their endless torment, as if they were warning her of the fate that awaited her. When she awoke, drenched in sweat, she realized she was not in her sleeping bag, but standing several feet from the campfire. Her breath came in short gasps as she spun around, disoriented. The fire had burned out completely, leaving the campsite bathed in moonlight. Shadows flickered unnaturally, and she realized with horror that she wasn't alone. Mark stood a few feet away, staring blankly at the path leading toward the summit. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his lips moved silently, as if repeating a prayer. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest before stepping closer. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but the moment her fingers grazed his jacket, he recoiled violently, his head snapping toward her with an expression of raw terror. His eyes looked almost inhuman, filled with an intensity that made her stumble back. "They're watching us," Mark muttered, his voice low and hoarse. "They've been watching us since we arrived. They know we don't belong here." "Who?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "The mountain," he hissed, pointing toward the summit. "It's alive. It's hungry." Before Emma could respond, a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. It came from the direction of the tents, shattering the fragile silence. Emma and Mark exchanged a panicked glance before rushing back to the campsite. When they arrived, they found Ian standing over Sarah's tent, his hands trembling as he held a flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the inside of the tent, where Sarah lay thrashing in her sleeping bag, her face contorted in agony. Her hands clawed at her throat as if trying to tear something away. "What happened?" Emma demanded, dropping to her knees beside Sarah. She grabbed her shoulders, trying to hold her still. Ian shook his head, his face pale. I, I don't know. She started screaming in her sleep. I tried to wake her up, but she won't snap out of it. Sarah's eyes flew open, but they were unseeing, glazed over as she let out a guttural scream. Emma felt helpless as she watched her friend's body contort in unnatural ways, her limbs jerking violently. "We need to do something," Emma shouted, turning to Ian and Mark. But before anyone could move, Sarah's body went limp. Her breathing slowed to a shallow rasp, and her eyes fluttered closed. Emma checked her pulse, her hands shaking. It was faint, but it was there. She's alive," Emma said, her voice cracking with relief. But as she looked closer, she noticed something strange. Dark veins spidered across Sarah's neck and face, pulsating faintly as if something was moving beneath her skin. Ian took a step back, his face twisting in fear. "What the hell is happening to her?" he whispered. Mark knelt beside Emma, his expression grim. "It's the mountain," he said quietly. "It's doing this to her. It's trying to break us." Emma felt a surge of anger and fear. "Then we have to leave," she said firmly. "We can't stay here any longer. We'll carry Sarah if we have to, but we're not spending another night on this cursed mountain." But as she spoke, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, weaving through the air like a sinister melody. The hikers froze, their eyes darting around the campsite. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding them in an invisible grip. "It won't let us leave," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not until it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" Ian asked, his voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. The mountain's whispers spoke for him, their sinister tone carrying a single chilling message. Stay or sacrifice. The hikers knew they were trapped. As the whispers grew louder, the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in the firelight. The mountain was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had claimed them as its own. As dawn's first light broke over the mountain, a cold, gray fog blanketed the summit. The hikers were now scattered, their once cohesive group splintered by paranoia and fear. Sam stood alone, clutching a rock for protection. His clothes were torn, his hands trembling. The whispers had grown louder, evolving into a cacophony of overlapping voices, each speaking in a language that scraped at his sanity. Somewhere in the fog, Alex screamed. The sound was cut short, replaced by an eerie silence. Sam's instincts told him to run, but where? The summit was no longer a place. It was a living, breathing thing. The ground beneath him pulsed faintly, like the beat of a colossal heart. "Sam!" The voice was soft, melodic, and undeniably human. He spun around to see Eva standing just a few feet away. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. "Eva, you're alive!" Relief flooded Sam as he moved toward her. "We need to get out of here. We need to—" Eva raised a hand to stop him. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "It won't let us go." Before Sam could respond, the fog parted, revealing the rest of the group, or what was left of them. Alex's lifeless body hung suspended in midair. Tendrils of black mist coiled around his limbs like serpents. His face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Lily knelt on the ground nearby, her hands clawing at her own face as if trying to tear away something unseen. Blood streaked her cheeks, but she seemed oblivious to the pain. "What is this?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. Eva didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer to him, her movements slow and deliberate. It was then that Sam noticed something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her feet didn't touch the ground. Her shadow, distorted and elongated, stretched unnaturally behind her, merging with the shadows of the rocks. "Eva!" Sam's voice cracked. "What's happening to you?" She smiled, a sad, resigned smile. "I tried to fight it, Sam. I really did. But the mountain, it's in me now. It's in all of us." Suddenly, the whispers surged, louder than ever, drowning out all thought. Sam clutched his head, his knees buckling as the voices invaded his mind. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were images, memories, feelings. He saw the mountain's history unfold before him, a grotesque tapestry of sacrifice and despair. For centuries, it had lured travelers to its peak, feeding on their fear, their pain, their madness. Those who survived became part of it, their souls woven into the very fabric of the mountain. Sam's vision blurred as the ground beneath him seemed to shift and ripple. The rocks morphed into faces, their hollow eyes staring at him, their mouths whispering in unison. Stay, join us, become eternal. No! Sam screamed, forcing himself to his feet. He stumbled backward, away from Eva and the grotesque tableau before him. He had to get out. He had to find a way down, even if it meant plunging into the abyss. But the mountain wasn't done with him yet. The fog thickened, forming walls around him, herding him toward the summit. The whispers turned into mocking laughter, echoing all around him. Sam ran blindly, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legs burning with exhaustion. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stop. And then he saw it, a massive, jagged stone altar at the very peak of the mountain. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves. Eva stood at the altar, her eyes now black voids, her body no longer fully human. She gestured toward the altar, her voice echoing with the mountain's power. It's your turn, Sam. The mountain demands its sacrifice. Sam shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I won't do it. You can't make me. Eva tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. You don't understand. It's not a choice. It never was. The ground beneath him quaked violently, and Sam fell to his knees. The faces in the rocks screamed now, their mouths stretching impossibly wide. Tendrils of mist wrapped around his arms and legs, dragging him toward the altar. He fought with everything he had, but it was no use. The mountain's will was absolute. As he was forced onto the altar, Sam's mind was flooded with one final, horrifying revelation. The mountain didn't just feed on fear, it thrived on the betrayal of hope, the shattering of trust. It had turned his friends against him, made them pawns in its eternal game. And now he was to become part of it, another voice in the endless chorus of whispers. The last thing Sam saw was the sky above the summit, dark and oppressive, as if the mountain itself had swallowed the sun. The last thing he heard was Eva's voice, soft and sorrowful, as she whispered, "Welcome home." Weeks later, a new group of hikers arrived at the base of the mountain, drawn by its breathtaking beauty and the promise of adventure. The locals warned them, as they always did, about the whispers, the disappearances, the curse. But the hikers, like so many before them, laughed off the stories and began their ascent. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, the silence deeper. And when night fell, they heard it, the faintest hint of whispers carried on the wind. The mountain stirred, its hunger eternal. Story number 2. The road ahead was barely visible, shrouded in a dense, otherworldly fog that seemed to pulse and breathe as if alive. Ethan adjusted the straps of his backpack, cursing his decision to take the mountain trail. What was supposed to be a scenic solo trek had turned into a nightmare. He'd lost the marked trail hours ago, and now the thick fog surrounded him, smothering the world into a cold and eerie silence. The sun had vanished behind the veil of gray, and with no way of knowing how far he had strayed, Ethan's hope of making it to the next ranger station before dark was quickly fading. His flashlight flickered as the batteries struggled against the cold. The trees around him loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Then, as if summoned by his desperation, a shadow emerged from the mist, a structure. Ethan froze, squinting at the shape. It was a cabin nestled between the towering pines. Relief surged through him as he hurried toward it, his boots crunching against frost-covered ground. The cabin was small but sturdy, with dark wooden walls and a slanted roof. A faint glow emanated from its single window, promising warmth and shelter. The air around the cabin felt different, warmer, almost inviting, as if the fog itself thinned out in reverence to the dwelling. Ethan hesitated for only a moment. In these conditions, there was no room for pride or skepticism. He stepped onto the creaking porch and knocked on the door. No answer. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice swallowed by the fog. Still nothing. He tried the door handle, and it turned easily. The door swung open with a low groan. Inside, the cabin was everything Ethan had hoped for. A roaring fire crackled in the stone hearth. A wooden table stood in the center of the room, with a steaming bowl of soup, and a worn armchair sat invitingly by the fire. It was a vision of comfort and safety, a sharp contrast to the unforgiving wilderness outside. But there was no one there. "Is anyone here?" Ethan asked, stepping inside cautiously. The warmth was immediate, seeping into his frozen limbs. He closed the door behind him and set his backpack down near the entrance. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed tucked into the corner, a kitchenette, and a door that likely led to a small storage space. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. He peeked into the small storage room, but it was empty, save for some firewood and tools. Maybe the owner had stepped out briefly. Or perhaps it was a hunting cabin left open for travelers, a tradition in some remote areas. Ethan decided not to question his luck. He needed warmth, rest, and time to plan his next move. He sat by the fire, letting its heat chase the chill from his bones. The bowl of soup on the table beckoned, and though it seemed odd, Ethan's hunger overruled his doubts. He took a cautious sip. It was delicious, rich and hearty, like something out of his childhood memories. As the night deepened, the cabin grew eerily quiet. The fire crackled softly, and the wind howled faintly outside. Ethan felt a strange unease creeping in, a sense of being watched. He shook it off. He was just tired, he told himself. Then the tapping began. Ethan sat by the fire, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the cold mountain air. The cabin's cozy interior was a balm for his weary body, but an undercurrent of unease buzzed in his mind. Who had left the fire burning, the meal freshly prepared? Where was the cabin's owner? He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the cabin was part of some mountain rescue initiative, left open for lost or stranded hikers. Or maybe the owner had stepped out to gather firewood and would return soon. Ethan resolved to leave a generous note of thanks and some cash if he had to leave before meeting them. But the tapping sounds had shattered the comfort he felt earlier. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was faint but distinct. He glanced toward the small window nearest the bed. Frost clung to the glass like spider webs, but through it he could only see the impenetrable gray fog outside. The tapping stopped, leaving the room in silence so profound it felt heavy. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, his muscles tense. "It's probably a branch," he muttered to himself, "just a branch scraping against the glass." He returned to his spot near the fire, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. The flames danced and cracked in the hearth, but the warmth felt different now, hollow like an illusion of safety. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time the sound moved to the window near the table. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. It wasn't random. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be circling the cabin. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" No reply came, only silence so thick it felt oppressive. Ethan grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, holding it like a weapon. He moved to the window, every step feeling heavier than the last. His breath fogged the glass as he peered outside, straining to see beyond the veil of mist. Nothing. No movement, no figure, no tree branches brushing the window. Just the endless swirl of gray fog. He turned away, the fire poker still clenched tightly in his hand. The tapping resumed, louder this time, at the window near the door. Ethan spun toward it, his breath catching in his throat. Something was pressed against the glass. At first it seemed like frost or condensation, but as Ethan stepped closer, he saw the unmistakable imprint of a hand. 5 long, thin fingers splayed against the glass, their shape unnatural. The handprint was too large, its proportions subtly wrong, as though it belonged to something not entirely human. Ethan staggered back, his pulse racing. The handprint began to fade, disappearing into the frost as if it had never been there. The fire flickered behind him, its light dimming. The warmth that had filled the cabin was gone now, replaced by a cold that seeped into his bones. And then he heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. But it grew louder, more insistent. The voice spoke in a language Ethan didn't recognize, its cadence sharp and guttural. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the very air around him. "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. The whispering stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. But the tapping resumed, rapid and frantic now, as if something was desperate to get inside. Tap, 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 tap. The windows around the cabin shuddered under the force of the noise. Ethan backed away, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. The handprints returned, spreading across every pane of glass, each one more grotesque than the last. Some were clawed, others were elongated and skeletal. They pressed against the windows, overlapping until the frost was a chaotic mess of shapes and smears. Ethan stumbled to the door, his breath ragged. He yanked it open, intending to flee into the fog, but what he saw stopped him cold. The cabin's surroundings had changed. Where there had once been a clearing surrounded by trees, there was now a vast, empty expanse of white. The fog rolled and swirled, forming shapes that seemed to mock human figures. The ground beneath his feet felt different too, cold and hard like stone. Ethan slammed the door shut, his chest heaving. The tapping ceased immediately, leaving the room in an eerie stillness. "Think, Ethan, think," he muttered, his voice shaking. He had to figure out a way out of this nightmare. But every instinct screamed that the cabin itself was wrong. The cozy fire, the prepared meal, the inviting warmth, it was all a facade, a trap. The whispering returned, louder and closer this time. Ethan turned toward the sound, his eyes darting around the room, and then he saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of the cabin, just at the edge of his vision. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a dark, hulking shape that didn't belong. Ethan raised the fire poker, his hands trembling. "Stay back," he shouted, though the words felt futile. The shadow didn't move, but the whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made his head throb. Ethan backed toward the fire, hoping its light might protect him. But the flames were dying now, shrinking to embers as the cold crept back in. And then, the shadow stepped forward. It wasn't a figure, not exactly. It was a void, a mass of darkness that seemed to consume the light around it. It had no discernible features, but Ethan could feel its presence, overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo as the shadow loomed closer. Ethan swung the fire poker wildly, but it passed through the void as if it wasn't there. The last thing he saw before the darkness enveloped him was the handprints on the windows, now glowing faintly, as if mocking his futile resistance. And then, everything went black. Ethan's consciousness flickered like a dying flame, his mind grasping at fragments of memory as he struggled to wake. He wasn't sure how long he had been out, minutes, hours, or even days. When his eyes finally opened, he was no longer in the cabin. The warmth of the fire, the faint crackling of embers, gone. He lay sprawled on the cold, unyielding ground, his body stiff with a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The dense fog had returned, coiling around him like a living thing. Ethan pushed himself upright, his muscles protesting with every movement. His breath came out in heavy clouds, dissipating quickly into the gray void around him. The terrain was barren, a lifeless expanse of jagged rocks and frozen earth. The cabin was nowhere in sight. He staggered to his feet, his heart pounding as he spun in a slow circle, searching for any sign of shelter or civilization. But all he could see was the mist, thick and impenetrable, stretching endlessly in every direction. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse and cracking. The sound echoed faintly before being swallowed by the fog. A sudden wave of nausea hit him, forcing him to double over. His stomach churned violently, and for a moment he thought he might vomit, but nothing came up. The sensation passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving him weak and trembling. As he steadied himself, Ethan noticed something strange. The ground beneath his feet was marked with faint footprints, their edges blurred as though they had been made long ago. They weren't his. They were too small, too delicate. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the footprints led away from where he stood, vanishing into the mist. Against every instinct, He began to follow them, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The whispers returned. They were faint at first, like a distant breeze carrying fragmented words. But as Ethan moved forward, they grew louder, more distinct. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Yet their tone was unmistakable, urgent, angry, and pleading all at once. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "Show yourself!" The whispers didn't respond. Instead, the footprints ahead of him seemed to shift, becoming clearer as though freshly made. Ethan's breath quickened, his pulse hammering in his ears. And then he saw it, a figure emerging from the fog. It was a woman, her silhouette barely visible in the swirling mist. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if listening to the whispers. Her long, tattered dress fluttered in an unseen breeze, and her hair hung in damp strands around her pale face. "Hey!" Ethan called out, relief flooding him. "Wait! I need help!" The woman didn't move. Ethan quickened his pace, stumbling over the uneven ground as he closed the distance between them. But no matter how fast he moved, she remained just out of reach, her figure retreating further into the fog. "Stop!" he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. Suddenly the whisper stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Ethan froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The woman had stopped too, her back still turned to him. Cautiously he approached her, each step feeling heavier than the last. "I don't know what's going on," he said, his voice shaking. "But if you know how to get out of here—" The woman turned. Ethan stumbled back, a scream catching in his throat. Her face was a twisted mockery of humanity, her features sunken and gaunt. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow, yet somehow fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, her head tilted back unnaturally, her jaw stretching wider than humanly possible. And then she lunged. Ethan fell backward, scrambling to put distance between them. But the woman didn't move like a person. She glided, her feet barely touching the ground as she closed the gap between them. "No!" Ethan screamed, swinging his arms wildly in an attempt to fend her off. His hand connected with something solid, and the woman let out a guttural shriek, recoiling momentarily. Ethan didn't wait to see if she would recover. He turned and ran, his legs burning with the effort as he tore through the fog. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, surrounding him from every direction. The terrain grew more treacherous, the ground sloping upward as jagged rocks jutted from the earth like the ribs of some massive, decaying beast. Ethan stumbled but forced himself to keep moving. The image of the woman's face burned into his mind. Ahead, the fog began to thin, revealing a massive cliff that jutted out over an abyss. The edge loomed closer with every step, but Ethan didn't slow down. He didn't care where it led. Anything was better than the nightmare behind him. As he reached the edge, he skidded to a halt, his breath hitching in his chest. The drop was sheer, plunging into darkness so deep it seemed bottomless. The whispers grew deafening, their voices blending into a cacophony that made Ethan clutch his head in agony. He fell to his knees, his screams swallowed by the noise. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. Ethan looked up, his vision blurred by tears. The fog had cleared, revealing a figure standing at the edge of the cliff. It was the woman, her hollow eyes fixed on him. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, dozens of other figures emerged from the mist. Men, women, and children, their faces twisted and broken, their eyes empty. They stood in a silent line, their gaze locked on Ethan. The woman raised a hand, pointing at him. Ethan shook his head, crawling backward. "No, please." The figures moved closer, their steps synchronized, their movements unnatural. The ground beneath Ethan began to tremble, and the air grew colder with every passing second. As the first figure reached him, Ethan felt a searing pain in his chest, as though icy tendrils were wrapping around his heart. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the woman's face, her mouth forming a word he couldn't hear. And then there was nothing. Ethan awoke to an eerie stillness, his body sprawled on the frozen ground. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the frigid air. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The cliff was gone. The figures were gone. Instead, he found himself in a vast open field covered in a thin layer of frost. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind whispering across the barren landscape. He pushed himself up, his body aching as though it had been through a wringer. The fog was thinner here, and he could see farther, but what he saw made his stomach churn. Scattered across the field were countless objects: broken lanterns, rusted tools, tattered pieces of clothing. They were remnants of people who had been here before him. Ethan staggered forward, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally, as though the sound itself was trapped in the strange, lifeless air. The objects grew more numerous, and soon he was walking through what felt like a graveyard of forgotten possessions. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something peculiar. Many of the items seemed freshly abandoned: modern backpacks, smartphones with cracked screens, even water bottles that still held liquid. It was as if the people who owned them had vanished just moments before. "Where am I?" Ethan whispered to himself, his voice trembling. As if in answer, a low, resonant hum filled the air. Ethan froze, his heart pounding as the sound grew louder, reverberating through the field. It was not a mechanical sound, nor was it entirely natural. It was something in between, a deep, otherworldly vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. He turned, his eyes scanning the horizon, and saw them again. The figures. They were farther away this time, their silhouettes barely visible through the thinning fog. But they were moving, gliding silently toward him in a wide, deliberate arc. Panic surged through him. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. "Stay away!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't respond. They continued their slow, relentless advance, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Ethan turned and ran, his legs pumping furiously as he fled across the field. The frost-covered ground was uneven, and he nearly tripped several times, but fear kept him moving. He didn't dare look back, the weight of their gaze pressing against him like an invisible force. Ahead he saw something, a structure rising out of the mist. It was a cabin, but not the one he had found earlier. This one was larger, its wooden frame weathered and ancient. The windows were shattered and the door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before sprinting toward it. He reached the cabin and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The interior was dark and cold, the faint scent of rot lingering in the air. He pressed his back against the door, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. For a moment all was silent. Then came the tapping. It started softly, a faint, rhythmic sound against the windows. Ethan's heart sank as he realized it was coming from all around the cabin. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like dozens of fingers drumming against the glass in unison. "No, no, no!" Ethan whispered, his hands trembling as he fumbled for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a rusted fireplace poker lying near the hearth. The tapping suddenly stopped. Ethan froze, the silence more unnerving than the noise. He held the poker tightly, his knuckles white as he strained to listen. And then he heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing, but it grew louder, clearer, until he could make out the words. "Come outside," it whispered, the tone soft and coaxing. "We only want to talk." Ethan shook his head violently, backing away from the door. "Leave me alone," he shouted. The voice laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You cannot hide, Ethan. The cabin belongs to us, and so do you." The door creaked ominously, the wood bending inward as though something was pressing against it. Ethan backed further into the cabin, his eyes darting around for an escape route. The room began to change. The walls seemed to close in, the wood darkening and twisting as though alive. Shadows flickered across the room, and the air grew colder with each passing second. A sharp, agonized scream pierced the air, coming from directly outside the cabin. Ethan flinched, his grip tightening on the poker. The scream was followed by another and another, until it became a cacophony of wails that seemed to come from every direction. The door burst open, and the figures flooded in. They moved like a swarm, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Ethan swung the poker wildly, the metal whistling through the air as he tried to keep them at bay. But they were too many, their sheer numbers overwhelming him. Hands, cold, clammy, and impossibly strong, grabbed at him, pulling him to the ground. Ethan screamed, thrashing desperately as the figures dragged him toward the center of the room. The floor split open, revealing a yawning abyss that pulsed with an unnatural light. The figures chanted in a language Ethan couldn't understand, their voices rising in a terrifying crescendo. As he was pulled closer to the abyss, Ethan felt a searing pain in his chest, as though his very soul was being torn from his body. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the glowing eyes of the figures, their hollow sockets filled with a terrible ancient hunger. And then, he was gone. The cabin stood silent once more, the door swinging gently in the wind. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the field and its scattered possessions. Far away in another part of the mountains, a lone traveler stumbled through the mist. In the distance, they saw a faint light, a warm, inviting glow coming from a cabin hidden in the fog. The cycle began again. Story number 3. The mountain loomed in the distance, its jagged peaks piercing through low-hanging clouds. 5 friends stood at the edge of a faded, nearly forgotten trail, staring at the thick forest ahead. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. Emma, the fearless leader of the group, stood at the front with a map in hand, her face lit with excitement. "This is it," she said, gesturing to the barely visible path ahead. The vanishing path. "Isn't it perfect?" Alex, her boyfriend, rolled his eyes. "Perfect for getting lost. Do we really want to hike some old trail that's famous for people disappearing?" Nathan adjusted his camera strap and smirked. "Come on, Alex, where's your sense of adventure? This place is a goldmine for photos. Imagine the stories I can tell when I post these pictures." Grace lingered near the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her hazel eyes scanned the towering trees, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers. "I don't like this," she said quietly. "Something feels wrong." Sam, ever the joker, nudged her. "Relax, Grace. What's the worst that could happen? Bigfoot eats us?" He laughed, but his attempt to lighten the mood only made Grace frown. The trailhead was marked by a rotting wooden sign, its lettering long since faded. Strange symbols were carved into the weathered surface, circles, jagged lines, and spirals that seemed to radiate menace. Nathan snapped a picture. "Creepy. I like it." "It's just a trail," Emma said with a shrug. "Legends like this are usually exaggerated. People probably got lost because they weren't prepared, that's all." "Or," Alex said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "because the trail is cursed, like the locals say." Emma ignored him. "We've got a full day of daylight, supplies for 3 days, and a map. We'll be fine." Reluctantly, the group followed her onto the trail. At first, the hike was uneventful. The path wound through the dense forest, sunlight filtering through the canopy in scattered beams. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across their path. But as they ventured deeper, the air grew colder. The cheerful sounds of wildlife faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The trees grew thicker and more twisted, their trunks scarred with the same strange symbols they'd seen at the trailhead. "Has anyone noticed how quiet it's gotten?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Sam said, glancing over his shoulder. "It's like we walked into a soundproof room." "It's just the altitude," Emma said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Alex snorted. "Altitude doesn't kill all the birds and bugs. This place is weird." Nathan stopped to photograph a particularly large symbol carved into a tree. It looked almost like a face, its hollow eyes staring back at him. "These carvings, they're too deliberate to be random. Someone or something put these here for a reason." "Don't psych yourself out," Emma said, but even she couldn't hide the unease in her tone. Hours passed and the trail grew narrower. Shadows stretched longer as the sun began its descent, casting an ominous glow over the forest. The group decided to stop at a small clearing to set up camp for the night. As they pitched their tents and gathered firewood, Grace's unease deepened. She felt as though unseen eyes were watching their every move. "Do you think anyone's ever finished this trail?" she asked Emma. "Of course," Emma replied, though she avoided making eye contact. "People probably just get scared and turn back. Or disappear," Alex muttered under his breath. The fire crackled to life as night fell. The group sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Sam pulled out a flask and took a swig before passing it around. "To surviving the vanishing path," he said with a grin. Nathan raised his camera. "Say cheese." The flash momentarily lit up the forest, and for a split second, Grace thought she saw something, a figure lurking just beyond the firelight. She gasped, clutching Emma's arm. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Emma asked, looking around. "There was, someone standing over there," Grace said, pointing into the darkness. The group fell silent, their eyes scanning the trees. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond it, the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. "You're imagining things," Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it was an animal," Sam offered. Grace shook her head. "No, it was a person. I'm sure of it." The silence that followed was broken by a faint sound, a low, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on the forest floor. "Okay, now I hear it too," Sam said, his voice trembling. "Probably just a deer," Emma said, though she gripped the flashlight tighter. Nathan aimed his camera toward the sound and took another photo. The flash illuminated nothing but trees, but when he looked at the image on the screen, his face went pale. "What is it?" Alex asked, leaning over his shoulder. Nathan didn't answer. He simply turned the camera around to show them the photo. In the background, partially obscured by the trees, was a shadowy figure. It had no distinct features, but its presence was undeniable. The group stared at the image in stunned silence. "Let's just go to bed," Emma said finally. "We're all tired, and our minds are playing tricks on us." But as they crawled into their tents and zipped them shut, the tapping continued, growing louder and closer. And in the silence of the forest, the vanishing path seemed to whisper its welcome. The night was suffocatingly quiet, save for the relentless tapping that grew closer and closer. Inside their tents, the group lay wide-eyed and alert, straining their ears to make sense of the sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and unnervingly human. Nathan, clutching his camera like a lifeline, whispered through the fabric of his tent. "Does anyone else hear that? It's circling us." "Shut up," Alex hissed. "Just stay quiet. Maybe it'll go away." Emma gripped her flashlight with trembling hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had always been the one to dismiss ghost stories, the skeptic of the group, but now she found herself unable to deny the overwhelming fear that something was out there, something watching. And then, without warning, the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. "Did it leave?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, a sound erupted, a low, guttural growl, deep and reverberating, like the earth itself was groaning. It came from the trees, but there was no clear direction, as if the forest was alive and mocking them. Emma unzipped her tent and stepped out, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay here," she whispered. "What the hell are you doing?" Alex demanded, crawling out after her. "I'm not just going to sit here waiting for something to happen. We need to know what's out there," Emma replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The others hesitated, but one by one, they joined her, huddling close around the fire. Nathan kept his camera at the ready, while Grace clung to Sam's arm, her eyes darting around the clearing. "Okay," Emma said, taking a deep breath. "We stick together. No one wanders off. Agreed?" They nodded, though fear was etched into every face. The group moved toward the edge of the clearing, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. The firelight faded behind them, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and twist like living things. "Do you see that?" Nathan whispered, pointing to a tree ahead. Carved into its trunk was another symbol, a large, jagged spiral surrounded by smaller runes. The edges of the carvings were sharp and fresh, as if they had been made just hours ago. It's the same as the others, Alex said, his voice trembling, but newer. Who would carve these out here? Grace asked, her grip tightening on Sam's arm. Before anyone could answer, the growl came again, louder this time. It seemed to echo all around them, coming from the very ground beneath their feet. Emma turned to Nathan. Take a picture. Nathan hesitated but raised his camera and snapped a shot. The flash illuminated the forest for a split second, and that was all it took. Run! Nathan screamed, stumbling backward. The group didn't question him. They bolted back toward the clearing, tripping over roots and branches in their blind panic. Behind them, the growling intensified, joined by the sound of snapping twigs and heavy footsteps. When they reached the fire, Emma spun around, shining her flashlight into the darkness. What did you see, Nathan? He was hyperventilating, clutching his camera to his chest. I don't know. It was a shape. It wasn't human. It had eyes. God, those eyes. Calm down, Emma said, though her own voice was shaky. We're safe here. Whatever it was, it didn't follow us. Are we? Grace asked, tears streaming down her face. Are we safe? Because it doesn't feel like it. Let me see the photo, Alex demanded, grabbing the camera. The image was blurry, but the outline of a figure was unmistakable. Tall and gaunt, it stood among the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. There was something unnatural about its posture, something predatory. That's it, we're leaving, Alex said, shoving the camera back at Nathan. I don't care about the damn trail. We're going back. At night? In this fog, Emma countered. We'll get lost. We need to wait until morning. Wait for what? Grace cried. For that thing to come back? For all of us to disappear? Sam stepped forward, his usual joking demeanor replaced with grim determination. Emma's right. We can't navigate in the dark. We'll keep the fire going and take shifts keeping watch. We'll leave as soon as there's light. Reluctantly, the group agreed, though none of them were eager to sleep. As the hours dragged on, the fog thickened, curling around the tents like ghostly tendrils. The fire crackled weakly, its light swallowed by the mist. Emma sat by the fire, clutching a stick as a makeshift weapon. Her flashlight sat beside her, its beam flickering in the damp air. She glanced at the others, huddled in their tents, their silhouettes barely visible, and then she heard it, the tapping. Slow and deliberate, it came from the edge of the clearing. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared into the fog, her fingers tightening around the stick. Who's there? She called, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. And then, from the mist, a voice answered, a voice that sounded eerily familiar. Emma, come closer. Her blood ran cold. It was her own voice. Emma froze, the stick slipping from her trembling hands. The voice that had just called her name was hers. Every inflection, every nuance. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she strained to see into the fog. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that twisted and danced like they were alive. Emma, don't leave me! The voice came again, softer this time but still unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, seeping into her ears and rooting itself in her mind. She turned toward the tents, her instincts screaming at her to wake the others. But when she opened her mouth to call out, no sound came. Her voice felt stolen, replaced by the eerie echo of her own words drifting back to her. The tapping resumed, louder, closer. It sounded as if someone or something was walking on the very air around her. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into near darkness. Only the weak, struggling fire cast a faint glow. Emma reached for it, desperate to reignite her light, but her hand faltered. Through the fog, a shape emerged. It was her. A mirror image of Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in mist. The figure's features were identical. Her dark hair, her wide, frightened eyes, even the tear in her jacket from earlier that day. But there was something deeply wrong. Its skin seemed too pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were empty. Emma, it whispered, the sound echoing like a wind blowing through hollow bones. You don't belong here. Leave. She staggered back, tripping over a log and falling to the ground. Her duplicate didn't move, but its expression seemed to twist. a mockery of her own fear. "Go away," she finally managed to scream, her voice breaking through her paralysis. The figure tilted its head, its blank eyes narrowing. And then it smiled. But before it could move, a hand gripped her shoulder. Emma flinched, ready to fight, but it was Alex, his face pale and drawn. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice a harsh whisper. Emma turned back to the clearing, but the figure was gone. Only the swirling fog remained. I saw something," she stammered, scrambling to her feet. "It looked like me. It spoke to me." Alex frowned, his eyes darting to the trees. "You're just tired. The fog's playing tricks on you." "No, it was real," she insisted, grabbing his arm. "It told me to leave." Before Alex could respond, Nathan and Grace emerged from their tents, drawn by the commotion. Sam followed close behind, his face set in a grim scowl. "What the hell is going on?" Nathan asked, clutching his camera like a shield. "There's something out there," Emma said, her voice trembling. It looked like me." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Okay," Sam said, taking charge. "We're not waiting until morning. Pack your stuff. We're leaving now." "But we can't see anything in this fog," Grace protested, her voice cracking. "It doesn't matter," Sam snapped. "Staying here isn't safe. Whatever's out there isn't going to wait until morning to make its move." The group hastily packed their gear, their movements frantic and disorganized. The fire sputtered out, leaving them in near total darkness. Emma's flashlight flickered back to life, but its beam was weak and unsteady. They started down the trail, sticking close together. The fog seemed to thicken with every step, clinging to their skin like a living thing. The trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "Do you hear that?" Nathan whispered. The group paused, their breaths hitching. Faint footsteps echoed behind them, the same deliberate rhythm they had heard before. But when they turned, there was nothing. "Keep moving," Sam urged, his voice tight. The footsteps followed them, growing louder and more numerous. It wasn't just one set, it was many. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Emma's flashlight caught another symbol carved into a tree, this one larger and more intricate than the others. The jagged lines seemed to writhe in the light, as if alive. "What do these mean?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're warnings," Alex said grimly, "and we didn't listen." The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a weight. And then from the fog ahead, a low, guttural growl rumbled. It was deeper and more menacing than before, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Nathan raised his camera, his hands shaking. "We need to document this. People need to know what happened here." "Forget the camera," Sam snapped. "We need to—" Before he could finish, a shadow moved in the fog. It was massive, towering over them, its shape indistinct but undeniably menacing. "Run!" Emma screamed. The group scattered, their survival instincts overriding their plan to stay together. Emma sprinted down the trail, her flashlight bobbing wildly. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. The shadow was following them, but it wasn't alone. Smaller shapes moved within the fog, their forms humanoid but twisted. They were fast, darting through the trees like predators. Emma's foot caught on a root, and she went down hard, her flashlight skidding away. Pain shot through her ankle as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching frantically for the others. "Help!" she screamed, her voice echoing into the void. The fog seemed to close in around her, the whispers returning, louder and more insistent. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. She wasn't leaving the mountain. A figure emerged from the mist, and for a moment, Emma's heart leapt with hope. But it wasn't one of her friends. It was her doppelganger. Its empty eyes stared into hers, its twisted smile widening. "You should have left when I told you," it whispered. Emma backed away, her heart pounding. The whispers grew deafening, the fog pressing against her like a physical force. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own face, grinning down at her. When Emma opened her eyes, she was standing on the trail, surrounded by mist. Her friends were nowhere to be seen. The whispers had stopped, leaving only an eerie silence. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone. She looked down and saw her body, pale, translucent, and fading. She was no longer among the living. Emma drifted through the mist, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of confusion and terror. She could see the world around her, the gnarled trees, the endless fog, the faint outline of the trail, but everything seemed distant, muted. Her hands were translucent, her form barely more than a shadow, and yet she could feel an unbearable heaviness in her chest, as though something was pulling her deeper into the fog. Her friends. She had to find them. She tried to run, but her legs didn't obey her. It was as if the air around her had turned to molasses, thick and oppressive. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Emma! The voice was familiar, but when she turned, no one was there. She spun around, her translucent form flickering like a candle flame, and saw shadows moving within the fog. They were human-shaped but distorted, their limbs too long, their movements unnaturally jerky. Alex? Grace? Nathan? Sam, she called, but her voice was swallowed by the mist, the echoes bouncing back to her in a mocking tone. She followed the trail, her movements sluggish but determined. The whispers returned, softer now, like a lullaby sung by a dozen voices. The strange symbols carved into the trees glowed faintly, their lines pulsing with an eerie light. As she approached one of the symbols, it shifted, the jagged lines rearranging themselves into a shape she didn't recognize. A chill ran through her as the whispers grew louder. "They're gone, Emma." The voice was cold, emotionless. She turned to see a figure standing in the fog, its form clear despite the haze. It looked human but wasn't. Its eyes were black voids, its skin a mottled gray, and its mouth curled into a twisted smile. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. "I am the keeper of the path. This place is mine, and so are you." Emma took a step back, her ghostly form trembling. "Let me go. Let all of us go." The keeper chuckled, the sound low and grating. "There is no escape. This trail is a boundary, a place between worlds. Those who enter it are mine to claim." "Where are my friends?" she demanded, her voice rising. The keeper raised a hand, and the mist parted slightly. Emma gasped as she saw faint outlines of her friends, Alex, Grace, Nathan, and Sam, wandering aimlessly in the fog. They looked lost, their faces blank, their movements sluggish. "They are here," the keeper said, "but they are no longer yours. The path has claimed them, just as it has claimed you." Emma clenched her fists, her translucent hands flickering with her frustration. "Why? Why are you doing this?" The keeper's smile faded, its black eyes narrowing. "This trail is cursed by those who were wronged, those who were forgotten. Long ago, this mountain was sacred to a people who lived in harmony with it. But invaders came, desecrated their land, and left nothing but death and ruin. The spirits of the lost cursed this trail, binding their pain and rage to it. Now it is a trap, a snare for those who dare to trespass." Emma's mind raced, her fear momentarily overshadowed by a spark of defiance. If the spirits are angry, if they want justice, why take us? We didn't do anything to them. The keeper stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The path does not distinguish. It hungers. It must be fed. And you were foolish enough to walk into its grasp. The fog thickened around Emma, the whispers growing deafening. She could feel the weight of the keeper's gaze, its dark eyes boring into her soul. But then something shifted. A faint light flickered in the distance, piercing through the fog like a beacon. Emma turned toward it, hope surging within her. The keeper hissed, its form flickering with anger. "You cannot escape," it roared, its voice echoing like a thunderclap. Emma didn't hesitate. She ran toward the light, her translucent form growing more solid with every step. The whispers tried to pull her back, the mist clawing at her like invisible hands, but she pushed forward, driven by sheer will. As she reached the light, she realized it was coming from another carved symbol, larger and more intricate than the others. It glowed with a golden radiance, its lines forming a pattern that seemed to pulse with life. Instinctively, Emma placed her hand on the symbol. A shock of energy surged through her, and the fog erupted into chaos. The whispers turned into screams, the ground shaking beneath her feet. The keeper lunged toward her, its form unraveling like smoke. "No! You cannot break the cycle!" It bellowed, its voice filled with fury. Emma closed her eyes, focusing on the symbol's warmth. She could feel the spirit's pain, their anger, their desperation, but she also felt something else, a deep, ancient sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. But this has to end." The symbol flared with light, and the fog dissolved, taking the keeper with it. The screams faded, replaced by a profound silence. When Emma opened her eyes, she was standing on the trail, her body solid and whole. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the mountain. Her friends lay nearby, unconscious but alive. She rushed to them, shaking them awake. One by one, they stirred, their eyes filled with confusion and relief. "What happened?" Alex asked, his voice hoarse. Emma smiled weakly, tears streaming down her face. "We made it out," she said. "We're safe now." But as they descended the mountain, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. The trail was quiet, the symbols gone, but the memory of the whispers lingered. And deep within the mountain, the keeper waited, its dark eyes watching, its hunger growing. Story number 4. Tom Bennett had always been drawn to the wild unknowns of nature. The hum of a distant storm, the challenge of reaching uncharted heights, the feeling of being a tiny speck in the vast wilderness. These things had a pull on him that no city, no matter how bustling, could ever offer. As a child, he had spent hours poring over books about explorers, mountaineers, and adventurers who braved the world's most dangerous places. Their stories had fueled his hunger for the mountains and the harsh environments that came with them. Now, as an adult, Tom had built a career around that obsession. He made a living guiding climbers on daring expeditions, setting personal records for the highest ascents and documenting his journeys for magazines. Yet there was one mountain that had intrigued him for years, the Howling Ridge. It wasn't famous for its height or its treacherous slopes, but for the strange phenomenon that accompanied it at nightfall. The locals in the nearby village, which lay nestled in the valley below the ridge, spoke in hushed voices of the ridge's eerie reputation. There were stories of travelers lost forever, of strange howling cries that drifted down from the mountain at night. The locals spoke of wolves, but the howls were never quite right, never quite like anything Tom had ever heard before. They said the cries had a rhythm, an unsettling tone that didn't belong to any animal. Despite their warnings, Tom felt an inexplicable pull to the place. It had become something of an obsession, a challenge he couldn't resist. He had always dismissed superstitions as the product of fearful minds, but as the months wore on, the thought of the Howling Ridge gnawed at him. What was it about this place that made grown men tremble? What was the source of those howls? When the opportunity arose to take a break from his usual work, Tom packed his gear, rented a small cabin in the village at the foot of the ridge, and prepared himself for the climb. The villagers seemed uneasy when he arrived. Their faces tightened when he mentioned his plan to ascend the ridge, their eyes darting nervously toward the towering silhouette of the mountain. But Tom had heard it all before. Warnings from locals, cautionary tales about dangers that didn't exist. That night, over a mug of lukewarm tea at the local tavern, one old man approached him, leaning in close. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "If you're going up there, you'd best be prepared for what's waiting for you. Some things you don't leave behind. The ridge doesn't take kindly to those who don't know what they're walking into. The howls, they're not just from wolves. They're from something older, something far worse. You'll see." Tom nodded politely but didn't respond. He had heard such stories countless times before. Perhaps it was simply the isolation, the wildness of the mountain, that made the locals spin such tales. Still, the old man's words stuck in Tom's mind as he made his way back to the cabin. Something about the old man's eyes had unsettled him. but he quickly shook off the feeling. It was just another story, another myth. The morning was crisp, the sky a pale blue that stretched endlessly over the snow-capped peaks of the mountain. Tom stood at the base of the howling ridge, feeling the weight of his gear on his shoulders as he surveyed the climb ahead. The first stretch was relatively gentle, nothing too difficult. He was familiar with the rhythm of a long ascent, the careful calculations required with every move, and the sharp focus necessary to avoid any potentially deadly misstep. The air was thinner here than what Tom was used to, and the cold bit at his exposed skin. He pulled his jacket tighter and adjusted the straps on his backpack. His boots crunched against the rocky ground as he began his ascent, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of difficulty. The ground was uneven, and the path led through a dense stretch of pine trees, their dark branches swaying in the wind. He had barely started when he noticed the trees seemed to grow quieter as he moved forward, the wind no longer rustling their needles. The silence was unnerving. Tom stopped for a moment and surveyed the scene around him. The valley below had begun to disappear, swallowed by the thickening forest. The village where the locals still went about their lives seemed miles away now. The only sounds were the faint scrape of his climbing axe against the rocks and the occasional gust of wind that cut through the ridge like a whisper from the mountain itself. He glanced up at the ridge above him. It loomed like a shadow over the land, dark and menacing, with jagged rocks that seemed to twist and tear at the sky. The ridge's very shape seemed unnatural, like a clawed finger pointing to some faraway place, beckoning him onward. As Tom took his first few steps up the more difficult sections, the path became steeper, more treacherous, and the rocks began to grow slick with ice. Every few minutes, he would pause to take in the view, the valley shrinking beneath him. He found a sense of tranquility in the isolation of it all, but with every passing step, he felt an odd sense of unease tugging at him. It wasn't the climb, it was something deeper, something buried within the mountain itself. He brushed it off his nerves, but the uneasy feeling persisted. The higher he climbed, the less familiar the landscape became. The rocks seemed sharper, the wind stronger, and the silence oppressive. Tom found himself looking over his shoulder more often than usual, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees behind him. The path began to narrow, and the mountain seemed to close in on him, as though the ridge were swallowing him whole. By midday, Tom had reached a small ledge, a natural plateau that provided a place to rest. He sat down on the jagged stone and pulled out a small ration of food, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The sun was beginning to dip behind the ridge now, casting long, twisted shadows across the landscape. The chill in the air had deepened as well, and Tom felt his breath catch slightly as the temperature dropped rapidly. He glanced upward, toward the summit, which was still miles away. It seemed like a far-off goal, one that would take longer than he had anticipated to reach. But that wasn't why he hesitated. It wasn't the climb itself. It was the nagging sensation that something was wrong. Something in the air felt off. The howl came as a distant whisper at first. At first, Tom didn't recognize it for what it was. It sounded like the wind, just another strange current of air drifting across the rocks. But then it came again, louder, sharper, a sound like a moaning cry. A howl, deep and drawn out. It carried a weight of sorrow, but also something else. Something primal and jagged. Tom's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened as he realized it wasn't the wind. It wasn't natural. The howls were too clear, too defined to be mistaken for something as benign as wind. He stood up and looked toward the direction of the sound, but there was nothing to be seen. The ridge stretched out before him, empty, silent, save for the eerie call. Wolves, he thought. It has to be wolves. The cry came again, this time closer, sharper, and more distinct. His breath caught in his chest and he felt his stomach twist. That wasn't the howl of a wolf, not at all. Tom quickly packed up his things and began to move, his mind racing as he glanced around, searching for any signs of danger. The howls came again, closer now, echoing off the jagged cliffs. The sound was hollow, unnatural, and Tom's gut told him that it wasn't a wolf. The voice that carried the cry wasn't something that belonged to this world. For a brief moment, he thought about turning back. He thought about descending and returning to the village, but something in his chest held him back. He wasn't a coward, and he wasn't going to let a sound, however strange it might be, stop him from completing this climb. So with a final glance over his shoulder, Tom began his ascent once again, determined to reach the top of the howling ridge, unaware that the ridge itself was already preparing to claim him. The air was growing colder with each step Tom took. The sun, now sinking lower in the sky, cast long shadows that stretched like the fingers of some unseen entity. Tom's breath puffed in the crisp air, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the mounting tension, a quiet, oppressive weight pressing down on his chest. The howls had stopped for a moment, and in that silence, Tom could hear the faint rustling of the pines and the occasional scrape of his boots against the rocky path. He paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, despite the freezing air. The mountain had become eerily still. The wind, which had been relentless earlier, now seemed to retreat, as if the ridge itself had decided to hold its breath. Tom stood there for a moment, listening. His eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no rustling, no sign of life. It was too quiet. Tom shook his head, trying to push away the growing unease that clung to his every thought. The locals had warned him. The howls, the strange atmosphere, the sense of something watching him. All of it pointed to a legend. A myth, maybe. But myths didn't have a place in Tom's world. He was a realist. He had no time for ghost stories or superstitions. There had to be an explanation, even if it was something as mundane as wildlife he wasn't familiar with, or the strange acoustics of the mountains. Yet as he resumed his climb, that lingering feeling of being watched refused to leave him. The higher Tom ascended, the steeper and more treacherous the ridge became. Jagged rocks jutted out of the earth like broken teeth, and the path had all but disappeared, leaving him to scramble up the mountainside. Each step took more effort as the air thinned, but Tom didn't stop. His mind was occupied with the idea of the summit, the accomplishment that awaited him if he could reach it. But the howls weren't gone. They lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him like a persistent itch. His heartbeat quickened as he heard it again, faint but unmistakable. The eerie, hollow cry that seemed to rise from the depths of the mountain itself. This time, it was closer. Tom froze, a shiver running down his spine. His eyes darted around the rocky ledge, but there was nothing. No movement, no predator in sight. The howl sounded as though it had been torn from the throat of something desperate, something that was hungry. And the hunger it spoke of wasn't the simple need for food. It was something far deeper, more primal. He swallowed hard and tried to shake off the rising panic. He was being foolish. Wolves, perhaps, or some other large creature. He needed to focus. There was no room for fear here. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back now. But as he began to climb again, the sound of the howl came once more, closer than before, and this time, something felt different. It wasn't just the sound, it was the rhythm of it, the way it echoed off the rocks, reverberating in his chest like a deep, guttural growl. It was almost as if the cry were a signal, something intentional, and that thought made Tom's blood run cold. The sun was nearly gone now, and the shadows had turned long and twisted across the jagged rocks. Tom had reached a narrow ledge that wrapped around the side of the ridge, leading him toward a more exposed section. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the path ahead. The howls had grown quieter for a time, but they hadn't stopped. Just focus, he told himself. Get through this, and then you'll be at the top. You're almost there. His foot slipped on a loose rock, and he cursed under his breath as he caught himself just in time. The ledge was treacherous, barely wide enough for his boots to find purchase. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, each second stretching longer than the last. He moved on. The moon had risen by the time Tom reached a higher plateau. The once crystal-clear sky was now covered with a veil of mist that clung to the rocks like a ghost. He could barely see the path in front of him, and his sense of direction was starting to blur as the ridge narrowed even further. The sharp, jagged rocks that formed the sides of the ridge towered over him like giant, looming sentinels. And then, just as he reached the edge of the plateau, he heard the howl again. But this time it wasn't just one. It was a chorus of wails all echoing off the surrounding cliffs, a symphony of agony and hunger. Tom froze, the blood draining from his face, as he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming from every direction, swirling around him like the sound of 1,000 voices calling in the night. The howls were no longer distant, no longer the product of some imaginary creature. They were here, on the ridge, all around him. Tom's mind raced. He looked around frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no place to hide, no trees to shelter him, no caverns to retreat into. He was exposed, alone, and surrounded by the eerie wails. He was being hunted. The hairs on his arms prickled as he heard one particular howl grow louder, closer, sharper. The sound was right behind him. Before he could react, the air around him shifted. A sudden chill seemed to settle on the mountain, the temperature plummeting as if the very atmosphere had turned against him. The rocks beneath his feet began to tremble slightly, as though the mountain was alive, its pulse quickening. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The ground beneath him began to crack, fissures forming where there had been none before. The howls grew more distinct, more human-like, as if they were somehow changing. No longer just the cries of animals, but something else. The howls twisted into words. Not words he could understand, but the tone, the rhythm, the unnatural cadence. It was like a voice trying to communicate, a voice that wasn't human. He spun around, his eyes wide, searching for the source, but there was nothing. No movement, no figure emerging from the mist. Just the sound, growing louder, louder still. Tom stumbled backward, his heart racing as he began to panic. He turned and ran, his feet slipping on the loose rocks as he tried to make his way back down the plateau. But it was as if the ridge itself was shifting, changing with every step he took. The path twisted, curved, and looped back on itself in a maddening spiral. He was trapped. The howls grew louder, closer. Tom turned to look behind him, a surge of terror flooding his veins. A shape was emerging from the mist, a shape unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was not an animal, not a wolf, not a bear. It was something else. The creature stood on two legs, its skin a sickly gray, hanging loose like an old rotting cloth. Its eyes gleamed with a strange intelligence, and its mouth was open in a grotesque grin, revealing teeth that were not quite human. Its limbs were long and gangly, and its fingers twisted unnaturally, like claws reaching for him. The howl came again, louder, almost deafening, and then the creature spoke. Its voice was a twisted mockery of human speech, deep, guttural, and cracked like the sound of old bones grinding against one another. "You shouldn't have come." Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the ridge wasn't just an unyielding mountain. It was a trap. And the creature, it, was the hunter. The howls were no longer just a sound. They were a warning. Tom's legs burned as he ran, the jagged rocks tearing at his boots, sending jolts of pain through his body with every misstep. His heart hammered in his chest and his breath came in frantic gasps. The creature's voice echoed in his ears, that mocking tone still reverberating in his skull, the words twisted like a snake coiling around his thoughts. "You shouldn't have come." The creature's words had seared into his brain, and now they haunted every footstep he took. The howls continued to fill the air, becoming more frantic, more desperate, as if the creature was beckoning others to join in the hunt. Tom couldn't escape them, couldn't escape it. The terror was not only in the creature, but in the mountain itself, the air thick with a malignant presence that closed in on him like a vice. He had to get away. He had to escape the ridge. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he pushed himself, the terrain grew more treacherous. The path before him seemed to stretch out infinitely, and every turn he made led him back to the same rock formation. The plateau he had just passed was now a distant memory, and the ridge, which had once seemed like a challenge to overcome, was now a relentless labyrinth of confusion and despair. The howls were growing louder, but Tom dared not look back. He could hear the shuffling footsteps of the creature growing closer, its guttural breathing scraping the edges of his sanity. It was gaining on him. His lungs burned and his vision blurred with exhaustion. His legs were giving out from beneath him. Panic clawed at his chest and the weight of the mountain pressed down on him, like 1,000 tons of stone. The realization began to settle in with chilling clarity. There was no way out. He was trapped in this hellish maze, and the creature was coming for him. Tom stumbled and collapsed against a jagged boulder, gasping for air. He tried to steady himself, his hands trembling as they gripped the cold, unforgiving stone. The wind had picked up again, but it felt wrong, as if it carried the scent of decay with it. His mind screamed at him to move, to keep running, but his body was betraying him. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else as he struggled to rise to his feet. But then, just as he thought he could take no more, the howls stopped. An unsettling silence settled over the ridge, broken only by the ragged sound of Tom's breathing. The creature's voice, the words it had spoken, rang in his mind, and for a moment the world around him seemed to fade. It felt as though the mountain itself had paused, holding its breath as if waiting for something. That something, he realized with horror, was him. For a long moment, Tom stood there, frozen in place, straining to hear any sound that might signal the creature's approach. But nothing came. The eerie silence stretched on, and Tom's mind began to unravel. He couldn't understand it. The howls had been so close, so real. He had felt the creature's presence, its oppressive weight on his chest. But now there was nothing. Had it gone away? The possibility sent a fleeting spark of hope through Tom's mind. Maybe it had lost interest. Maybe it had retreated. But as soon as the thought took root, the howls returned. Louder this time, more insistent, a cacophony of agony and hunger that tore through Tom's mind, shattering any semblance of calm. The sound filled his chest with a sickening pressure, and every fiber of his being screamed for him to run. But where? Where could he go? The mountain had become a maze, an endless loop that trapped him within its grasp. The path had vanished, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to hang in the air. And then through the howling wind, a voice whispered. It wasn't the creature's voice. This one was softer, almost familiar. Tom. The sound of his name sent a cold shiver down his spine. His body stiffened as he spun around, his heart skipping a beat. His eyes scanned the darkness, but there was nothing. No figure, no shape, only the swirling mist. The voice had been clear, almost comforting, yet something about it didn't sit right. It had come from inside the mountain, from the depths of the ridge itself. Tom? The voice came again, but this time there was a subtle twist to it, a shift that made Tom's blood run cold. The tone was no longer familiar. It was laced with something darker, something that made the very air around him seem to tremble. He backed away, his legs unsteady, his mind racing. There was no time to think, no time to reason. Whatever this was, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the voice continued. Turn around, Tom. And so, against every instinct in his body, against the deep, primal fear that was clawing at his soul, Tom turned. The sight before him was enough to make his blood freeze. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a silhouette, tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its face was hidden, but Tom could feel its eyes on him, boring into him like twin needles of ice. The creature was there, but it wasn't the same as before. It was different. It had changed somehow, its form shifting like liquid, like a shape constantly in flux. Its edges blurred in and out of focus, as though it didn't belong in the world of the living. The howls had stopped, replaced by the eerie, rhythmic breathing of the thing that stood before him. Why are you here? The voice said again, this time clearer, more demanding. It wasn't just a question, it was an accusation. The words carried the weight of centuries of hunger and darkness, as if they had been waiting for him, waiting for anyone to venture too close. Tom tried to speak, but his throat had gone dry. His mind was a jumbled mess of fear and confusion, the presence of the creature overwhelming him. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of what he was seeing. Leave! The creature growled, its form shifting once more, its limbs elongating, twisting at impossible angles. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have stayed. The air around Tom seemed to grow colder still, the temperature plunging into the depths of hell. Every part of him screamed to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pits of blackness that seemed to draw him in, sucking the very life from him. The howls returned, louder than ever before, echoing through the ridge like the final call of a dying world. And then, without warning, the creature lunged. The creature's form surged forward, its long limbs twisting unnaturally in the darkness, like a grotesque shadow weaving through the air. Tom barely had time to react. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. Fear paralyzed him, rooted him to the spot, his heart thundering in his chest like a drum beat that echoed through the silence of the ridge. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of decay and rot, and Tom could feel the mountain itself pressing in on him, suffocating him with its oppressive weight. The howls, once distant, now filled the air with a maddening fury. They were not just sounds, they were alive, crawling under his skin, burrowing into his mind. "Run!" the voice inside him screamed, but he couldn't move. The creature's shadow reached him in an instant, its form expanding like a collapsing wave, its grotesque, skinless face now inches from his own. The emptiness of its eyes, blacker than the night, reflected only a hollow hunger that seemed to devour everything in its path. Tom could hear its breath, ragged, wet, like something that had long ago lost the ability to breathe properly. With a horrific, rasping sound, the creature opened its mouth, its lips peeling back to reveal rows of jagged, broken teeth, gleaming white in the dim light of the ridge. It didn't make a sound. Instead, it seemed to stare, as if contemplating Tom's fate. It could kill him in an instant. It didn't need to rush. It was savoring the moment. Tom's chest constricted, his breath shallow and fast, as his mind scrambled for some way out of this nightmare. There had to be something he could do. He had come here to conquer the ridge, to claim it as his own, to climb the tallest mountain and stand at its peak as proof of his strength. But now he wasn't the conqueror, he was the prey. His gaze flickered to his surroundings, desperate for an escape. But the jagged rocks, the shifting shadows, the eerie silence, they all seemed to close in on him. The ridge had become alive with malice. The very ground beneath him seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the ridge itself was a living creature, a predator that knew no mercy. A sudden flash of movement caught Tom's eye, and for a moment he thought he saw something. A figure in the distance, a silhouette standing at the edge of the ridge. But it was gone in an instant, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. His heart skipped a beat. Was it another mountaineer? Was someone else trapped here too? Before he could fully process the thought, the creature's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. Tom's feet dangled, his boots scraping against the jagged rocks below, his mind spinning as panic surged through him. The creature's grip tightened, its fingers like iron around his throat, and he gasped for air, choking on the overwhelming stench of death that surrounded it. "You don't belong here," the creature's voice rasped, its breath hot against Tom's face. The words were sharp, guttural, each one laced with venom. "You never belonged here." Tom's vision swam, his thoughts growing more disjointed as the creature's grip began to squeeze. His body felt heavy, the world narrowing down to a single point, the creature's hollow eyes staring into his very soul. And then, just when he thought he would pass out, the creature released him. Tom crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he tried to suck in oxygen. The ridge felt like it was spinning beneath him, the ground shifting in a sickening dance. He had no time to recover. The howls returned, louder than ever, so close now that they seemed to reverberate in his bones. The creature had let him go, but the night was far from over. The silence between the howls was deafening, almost unbearable. Tom struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him, and for a moment he thought he saw it again. That figure, the silhouette at the edge of the ridge. Was it real? Or was his mind beginning to fracture under the weight of his fear and exhaustion? He had to move. He had to get away before the creature returned. His survival instinct kicked in, and he stumbled forward, his body still trembling from the encounter. The darkness swallowed him, but there was no escape from the ridge. It felt like a maze now, the paths winding and twisting in impossible directions. Every step he took seemed to lead him nowhere, every turn bringing him back to the same boulder, the same outcropping, the same endless cliff face. His mind spun, and the realization hit him with gut-wrenching force. He was trapped. This wasn't a mountain. It wasn't just the creature hunting him. This was something far worse. The ridge itself was alive. As Tom moved, the howls grew louder, more distinct, echoing in every direction. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere. He couldn't tell if they were real anymore, or if they were just a figment of his tortured mind. The creature had made it clear he would never escape. The ridge had already claimed him. It had claimed all those who had dared venture here before him. With each passing moment, Tom felt his sanity slipping further away. He stumbled into a small hollow in the ridge and collapsed against a cold rock, his body shaking with terror. His breath came in shallow gasps as the howls continued to circle him like vultures, closing in with every second. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure. This time, it wasn't just a silhouette. It was a man, another mountaineer, but not like any Tom had ever seen. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt and pale, and his eyes, wide and unblinking, stared back at Tom with an eerie familiarity. For a moment, Tom froze, unsure whether he was hallucinating or if the figure was real. But then, the man spoke. "You're not the first." The words were soft, barely audible over the howls, but they cut through the silence like a blade. The figure stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, like a shadow that moved against the grain of the world. His face remained fixed, unreadable, but Tom could see the depth of the despair in his eyes. The man's gaze flickered to the ridge behind him, and then back to Tom. "You'll never leave," the man whispered, his voice a hollow echo in the night. Tom tried to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his body frozen in place, as the man's words sank in. "You're part of it now. You'll never leave." The figure began to dissolve into the shadows, fading into the darkness as though he were nothing more than a ghost. And with his disappearance, the howls returned, louder, more chaotic, swirling around Tom as if the entire ridge itself was alive, hungry, and closing in on him. Tom didn't know how much longer he could endure this torment. His thoughts were starting to blur, his perception twisting. Was this real, or was this the final phase of his madness? The creature's presence had already warped his sense of time, and now the shadows of the ridge seemed to stretch and twist in every direction. But one thing was certain, the howls were getting closer. Tom's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to cooperate. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the very air was pushing back against him, trying to drag him deeper into the heart of the ridge. The howls had become a constant, gnawing presence, piercing his thoughts, feeding on his terror, until they were all that remained in his shattered consciousness. The voice of the man, the shadow that had warned him, echoed in his ears. "You're part of it now. You'll never leave." Tom had no idea what that meant, but he felt it in his bones. The air was thick with something ancient and malevolent, something that didn't belong on this earth. The ridge wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a living entity, and the howls were the cries of its victims. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the jagged peaks and biting into his skin, and he found himself stumbling forward, eyes wide, his heart racing. The shadows of the ridge seemed to dance around him, mocking him, and every rock, every outcropping of stone now appeared like an insurmountable obstacle. Tom's thoughts grew increasingly fractured. His mind pulled in 1,000 directions, as if the ridge itself was digging its claws into him, pulling him into its madness. In the distance, he saw something, another silhouette. His pulse quickened, his breath hitching in his throat. Was it the man again? Had the creature sent him some twisted messenger? This was different. The figure seemed to be moving toward him, its steps slow, deliberate. Unlike the haunting shadow of the man he had seen before, this one was solid, real. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but Tom felt an inexplicable pull toward the figure, as if it might hold the key to his survival. As the figure drew nearer, the details became clearer. It was a woman dressed in rugged mountaineering gear. Her face was obscured by a heavy scarf, but her eyes, like a piercing light in the storm, shone through, filled with a strange resolve. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cutting through the howls. It was calm, measured, but there was an undeniable edge of urgency to it. "You're already too late." Tom froze, the words sinking into him with an unbearable weight. "Too late? What do you mean?" he gasped, his voice shaking. "How do I get out of here? Please help me." The woman shook her head. "There is no getting out." She stepped closer, lowering the scarf just enough to reveal a face worn with age and experience. Her eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had seen too much. She looked at Tom like someone who had long ago accepted the impossible truth of this place. The ridge, it traps you. It twists your mind until you forget everything. Who you are, why you came here, what you once believed. Tom's heart raced as he tried to grasp the enormity of her words. But you're here. You're still alive." His voice cracked with desperation. "You must know how to escape. Please." The woman smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it, just a quiet resignation. "Escape?" she echoed. "The ridge doesn't allow escape. It doesn't want you to escape. It wants your soul. It feeds on your fear, and it gets stronger with each victim it claims." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "You may think you can fight it. You may think you can outlast it, outrun it, but it will never let you go." A cold gust of wind howled through the ridge, carrying with it the haunting sound of the creature's voice, low, rasping, as though it was whispering directly into Tom's ear. He felt it in his chest, the sickening pull of its presence, the promise of death just beyond his reach. The howls circled them, growing louder, more insistent. The woman took a deep breath, her gaze distant for a moment, as if she were remembering something she wished she could forget. "I thought I could outrun it too," she said softly. "But it's not just the creature you need to fear. It's the ridge itself." Tom looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her expression turning grim. "It doesn't just trap you physically. It traps your mind, your very essence. It feeds on your memories, your regrets, your deepest fears. It forces you to relive them again and again until you lose yourself completely." Her words struck him like a cold slap. Relive them? What did she mean by that? What was she talking about? But before he could ask, she turned sharply, her hand gripping Tom's arm with surprising strength. "Come with me," she said urgently. "I can show you. We don't have much time." Tom's heart pounded as he followed her, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to protest, to demand answers, but the words never made it past his throat. The howls were closing in again, louder now, and the ridge seemed to shift beneath his feet. The path ahead became obscured by shadows, and Tom could feel the temperature plummet, his breath turning to mist before him. They walked in silence, the woman's pace steady, unwavering. The ridge grew darker, colder. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. Tom could barely see ahead of him, and yet he felt an odd compulsion to keep moving. There was no turning back now. The woman's presence, though strange and unsettling, was the only thing that made him feel even remotely tethered to reality. The darkness was consuming him, pulling him into its endless void. Then, without warning, the woman stopped, her gaze locking with Tom's. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. For the first time, she seemed vulnerable, as if the weight of what she was about to reveal might crush her entirely. "Listen to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ridge, the creature, it's not just some twisted legend. It's alive. It has always been alive. It was created or summoned by something far older than any of us. Some say it was a curse, others say it was a portal, a bridge to something darker." She paused, her eyes flickering to the shadowed cliffs around them. "All we know for sure is that once you step foot on this ridge, it marks you. It binds you." Tom stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean, binds you?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. "It takes everything, your memories, your future, your soul, and it keeps them in the ridge, trapped, for eternity." Tom's pulse quickened, his throat tightening. He shook his head, trying to understand. But what about you? How long have you been here? The woman's lips trembled as she finally looked up, her expression filled with a deep, painful sorrow. I came here as a young mountaineer. I thought I could conquer the ridge, just like you. I thought I was strong enough to survive, but I wasn't. And now, I'm just a part of it. I'll never leave. Tom's stomach churned. The howls were louder now, impossibly close. He could feel them vibrating through his chest. The ridge was closing in, its hunger insatiable. You have one choice left, she whispered. You can join me here in this hell, or you can fight. But know this, fighting the ridge, fighting the creature, it will break you. You won't win. No one ever does. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Tom stood frozen, the fear washing over him like a tide, drowning him in its depths. There was no way out. There was no escape. And the howls, the endless, shrieking howls, were the only answer. The wind howled through the mountains once again, and Tom felt it, a coldness deep within his bones. It was the same coldness that had filled the woman's eyes, the same emptiness he now felt creeping over him, as though the ridge itself had begun to claim him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for the first time, he truly understood the weight of the woman's warning. There was no escape, no turning back. Fight it, he whispered to himself, as though willing his legs to move, to push him forward. The woman had given him an out, a way to join her in the torment of the ridge, to resign himself to the curse that would surely consume him. But he couldn't accept it. Not yet. He wasn't ready to surrender. The howls were closer now, surrounding him, closing in. They were no longer just sounds in the distance. They were physical, pressing against his eardrums, vibrating in his skull. And with every passing second, they grew louder, angrier, as if they knew that he was on the edge of breaking, that he was running out of time. But there was something else, too. Something in the rhythm of the howls that sent a chill down his spine. It's not a wolf, it's a voice. Tom shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. The woman's words echoed in his thoughts, mixing with the howling wind and the sounds of his own rapid breathing. The ridge wants you to forget. It wants you to lose yourself. She had said that earlier, her face pale with fear. But you can't forget. You have to remember. It's your only chance. Tom clung to her words as he pushed forward. The ground beneath his boots felt unstable, as though the very earth itself was shifting, warping, playing tricks on him. He stumbled, his eyes darting to the shadows around him. The ridge was moving. He was sure of it. The rocks that had once seemed solid now appeared to stretch on forever, bending and twisting. The path before him was growing darker, the mist thickening until he could barely see beyond his outstretched hand. And then, through the thick fog, he saw it, a figure, a tall shape, moving with the same deliberate steps he had seen earlier. It was the woman, the one who had tried to warn him, but something was wrong. Her silhouette was sharper now, more defined. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. She was no longer the guide, the source of fleeting hope. She was a part of the ridge. No! Tom gasped, his voice breaking as he took a step back. No! 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 But it was too late. The figure lurched forward, her eyes hollow, dark as pitch. The scarf that had once obscured her face hung loosely around her neck, revealing a mouth too wide, too stretched. Her lips parted in a horrific smile, too large to belong to a human. Her teeth were yellowed, sharp, and uneven, gleaming in the dim light of the ridge. You should have listened, she croaked, her voice no longer human. It was distorted, like 1,000 voices layered on top of one another. You never leave. You'll never leave. Tom stumbled back, his heart pounding. The howls intensified, filling the space around him with an overwhelming pressure. The woman's smile twisted into something more grotesque, her eyes glowing with an unnatural, malignant light. He turned and ran, fear surging through his veins as he sprinted into the fog. The ridge was alive. The rocks, the wind, the very earth beneath his feet. It was all part of it. He could feel it now, the way the ground shifted under him, pulling him in every direction. The howls grew louder, closer. And then he heard something else. A voice, clear, unmistakable. Tom, his heart stopped. The voice was soft, familiar, almost comforting. It sounded like his mother. His heart lurched in his chest as he stumbled, his mind racing. It's not real. It's not her. But the voice was so convincing. It was so close. He could almost see her, standing just beyond the mist. Tom, the voice called again, its sweetness now tainted with something darker. Come here, my son. Come to me. He stopped in his tracks, a part of him desperately wanting to follow. His legs shook, his hands trembling as he took a step forward. He could hear his mother calling to him, feel her presence pulling him forward. But something inside him screamed. It's not her. He shook his head violently. The ridge was playing tricks on him, trying to drag him deeper into its madness. He forced himself to take a step back, his breath ragged as he glanced around. The mist thickened, swirling around him, making it impossible to see anything clearly. He didn't know which way was up, which way was down. Everything was distorted. The howls grew louder again, and the voice faded into the distance. You have to leave. You have to keep moving. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Tom pushed himself forward again, his legs burning, his body crying out for rest. But there was no rest here, no safety. The ridge was endless. As he moved, he realized something even more terrifying. The path he was on had already begun to repeat itself. The rocks, the trees, the jagged ridge lines, they were all starting to look the same. No matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape. The ridge was drawing him back. It was closing in. And then, ahead of him, he saw the woman again, her silhouette standing just at the edge of the fog, waiting for him. But this time, something was different. Her face was no longer just a twisted mockery. It was something darker, something ancient. She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with a maddening intensity. You can't outrun it, she said, her voice now deep and guttural. This place, it bends you. It warps you. You will be one with it. Tom opened his mouth to scream, but the words caught in his throat. The fog closed in around him like a vice. The howls, the voice of his mother, the woman. It was all consuming him, blending into one deafening cacophony. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his eyelids wasn't empty. He saw the ridge, saw the twisting path that had no end, saw the faces of the other lost souls trapped within it, their eyes wide with terror. They were all waiting for him. It's too late. He felt it then, the ridge claiming him, pulling him into its folds, its endless hunger. His body began to twist and contort, his skin growing cold, his limbs stiffening. The voice of his mother whispered once more, now joined by the voices of the others. Come home, Tom. Join us. Forever. Tom's vision blurred, his body contorting as the unseen force of the ridge continued to work its dark magic. His limbs felt like they were being stretched, pulled, and compressed all at once. Every breath he took was heavy, suffused with the acrid, damp air of the mountain, and the howls swirled around him like a living thing, a constant reminder of the horrors he could not escape. For a moment, everything went silent. A stillness fell over him, so complete it felt unnatural, an absence that made his skin crawl. He dared to open his eyes, expecting more of the same nightmare, but what he saw made his heart drop. The woman's form, twisted, unnatural, was gone. The fog that had surrounded him thickened into a dense, suffocating wall. But there was something different about the landscape now. The ridge that once seemed to stretch endlessly upward now seemed to bend in on itself. The rocks that had been scattered across the path were now arranged in a perfect, repeated pattern. He'd seen this before. Tom swallowed hard as the reality of his situation hit him. The ridge isn't just alive, it's manipulating space itself. He staggered backward, his mind desperately clinging to the fleeting memories of his descent. The path, every step, had felt like a winding trail that could lead him to safety. But now, as he looked around, he saw it. The same jagged rocks, the same trees, the same distant howls. Everything was looping back on itself. The ridge was playing with him, trapping him in an endless cycle. His hands trembling, Tom bent down and ran his fingers over the rocks beneath him, hoping to find something, anything, that could break this endless cycle. But there was nothing. The stones felt smooth, like polished marble, yet somehow lifeless, empty of meaning. The howls grew louder again, and with them the voice returned, that soft, insistent whisper. Tom. It was his name, spoken so softly, so tenderly, that it should have been a comfort. But it wasn't. It was a taunt, a cruel reminder of his hopeless situation. His mother's voice, just as it had been before, called him, beckoning him into the fog. He turned toward the voice, his body reacting instinctively, his feet moving before his mind could stop him. "No!" he shouted, shaking his head violently. "You're not real. None of this is real." But still his feet carried him forward, against his will, toward the voice. Suddenly the fog parted for a brief moment, and Tom saw a figure standing at the edge of a cliff. A woman, tall and pale, her long hair floating in the wind. The same woman who had warned him, the same one who had died in the cursed ridge. She stood there, a sickly smile playing across her lips. "You can't outrun it," she said, her voice now cold and detached. "None of us can." Tom froze. His breath came in shallow bursts, his throat dry. The woman before him wasn't the one who had once tried to help him. No, this was something far worse, something much darker. Her smile widened grotesquely. "You should have listened." The air around him grew thick with an overwhelming pressure, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, watching, judging, waiting for him to fall. The howls began to crescendo again, louder, sharper, more distinct, until they no longer sounded like wolves at all. They were voices, clear as day, calling out to him, mimicking the voices of those he knew, his mother, his father, his friends. "Come to us, Tom. We are waiting for you." Tom's mind reeled. He could feel the ridge pressing in, suffocating him, breaking him down. He tried to take a step back, but his legs wouldn't move. His heart pounded wildly, but there was no escape. The ridge had him. It was wrapping its tendrils around his soul, pulling him deeper into its dark embrace. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. The ridge was shifting once again, warping reality. The very space around him seemed to buckle, distort, as if the world itself was crumbling into chaos. And then, the final terrifying truth emerged. The howls, those blood-curdling howls, were not coming from any creature. They were not wolves or any animal Tom had ever known. They were the cries of souls, the lost, the broken, the ones who had fallen to the ridge before him. Their voices, twisted and agonized, filled the air with a maddening chorus of despair. They were trapped, just like him. And now he understood. The ridge didn't just bend space, it took souls. It devoured them, twisted them into its own nightmarish world, and then kept them forever, looping in endless torment. Those voices, the ones he had heard since he first arrived, were the cries of the ones who had failed before him. They were the remnants of the ridge's victims, who had never escaped. Tom's mind broke under the weight of this realization. He felt his heart stop as the fog closed in once more, this time engulfing him completely. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear. The only thing left was the howling, the voices, the endless, unrelenting torment. Tom woke up. The fog was gone, the sounds of the howling muted, distant, as though they were no longer within earshot. He opened his eyes and blinked against the strange, dim light that filtered through the mist. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still trapped within the ridge's cursed grasp, or if he had finally broken free. But then, he noticed something. The rocks under his hands were the same. The ground beneath him, the trees ahead, it was all the same. The ridge had returned to its twisted state, the loop still intact. But there was something else, something subtle. The voices, the howls. They were quieter now, fainter, as if they were retreating, pulling back into the distance. Tom stood slowly, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His body felt heavy, sore, but the relief that came from the silence was almost too much to bear. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free of the sounds that had haunted him. He turned around. The woman, the one who had been lost to the ridge, was no longer in front of him. But in her place was something else, a shape, darker, formless, like a shadow that moved and shifted, its edges constantly changing. Tom's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a creature, it was the ridge itself. The ridge had taken form, and now it was staring back at him. The ground trembled again, but this time, the tremor felt different. The air crackled with an electric charge as if the ridge was awakening to something new. Tom's body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. He had no choice. It was the ridge's turn to claim him. Tom's body trembled as the shadowy presence of the ridge surrounded him. He could feel the weight of the cursed land pressing in on him, the ground beneath his feet seemingly alive with malevolent energy. The once chilling howls had grown to a deafening roar, swirling around him like the voices of the damned. And yet the figure before him, the living embodiment of the ridge, stood silent, its shifting form radiating an almost suffocating darkness. There was no escape, no way out. The fog thickened, as if to prevent him from even seeing the path ahead. The air grew dense, stifling, wrapping itself around Tom's chest and squeezing the very breath from his lungs. He could no longer hear the comforting sounds of his own heartbeat, only the deep, oppressive silence that followed the howls. This is it. Tom's thoughts raced as panic threatened to overtake him. He reached for his pack, as though there could be something, anything, to break this nightmare. But it was futile. His fingers brushed over the familiar straps, but they felt alien now, as if he had never touched them before. The pack was empty, just like him, just like the ridge. The shadow before him shifted again, pulling itself tighter into a grotesque figure, skinless and featureless, an aberration of what once had been human. The face that formed in the middle of the void was devoid of expression, but there was a presence there, a malicious sentience that made Tom's stomach churn. He didn't have to speak to it. He didn't have to ask questions. This was no longer the time for reasoning. He knew exactly what was coming. The creature's form contorted, its mouth opening wide as an unsettling, inhuman voice began to echo from within its depths. It wasn't a language that Tom recognized, but the meaning was clear. There is no escape, only endless suffering. In that moment, a strange calmness settled over Tom. The fear that had gripped him for so long, the desperate need to escape, began to fade. His mind, broken and exhausted, no longer clung to the false hope that there was a way out. There was only the ridge. He thought of his parents, of his friends, of the life he had left behind. They would never know what happened to him, how he had become yet another victim of the cursed ridge. A part of him had always feared this, the idea of being forgotten, of vanishing into the darkness with no one left to remember. But now in this moment, all of that seemed insignificant. The ridge would consume him, but it would consume everything eventually. The creature's form flickered, and suddenly the faces of the lost souls began to manifest, floating in the fog around him. They were the ones who had come before him, the ones whose voices had haunted him, their faces contorted in agony. He recognized them now. Sudden flashes of clarity allowed him to see their forms, their eyes pleading for release, their mouths silently screaming. The voices they had spoken were not their own. They had been hollowed out, their very essence absorbed into the ridge. Now they were mere echoes, shadows of who they once were. The creature's shape morphed again, this time into the form of a woman, a pale, familiar face. It was the woman who had warned him, the one who had tried to help him at the beginning. She stood before him, her once beautiful features now hollow and empty, as if the ridge had eaten away at her very soul. "Tom," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her own torment. "We cannot escape. We are part of it now." His chest tightened, his pulse racing. The woman's expression softened for a brief moment, as though she pitied him. Her lips parted, but the words she spoke were not hers. "We are waiting for you." The howls reached a fever pitch now, surrounding him, closing in on him like a wave crashing over the shore. It was too much. The pressure, the sound, the realization that this would be his eternity, his fate sealed. Tom felt his knees buckle, his body unable to withstand the overwhelming presence of the ridge. His breath became ragged, the air turning thick and heavy as he collapsed to the ground. But even as he fell, there was a strange, almost surreal peace in knowing the truth. The ridge had claimed him. There was no more running, no more fighting. He was just another part of its endless hunger, another victim to its ancient power. And then, just as quickly as the torment had begun, everything stopped. The howls faded into a whisper, the shadow before him dissipating like smoke. The fog cleared, revealing a strange stillness, a void where time itself seemed to have stopped. Tom opened his eyes, but there was no movement, no sounds, just the eerie silence that had filled his mind for what felt like an eternity. He stood up, shakily at first, but with an unsettling clarity in his mind. The ridge no longer seemed to stretch endlessly, nor did it feel alive in the same way it had before. He turned, and the once ominous path stretched out before him. It was familiar. It was his. He was no longer trapped. But then as he began to walk forward, he realized something. The world around him had changed. The landscape, the terrain, the fog. It all seemed wrong. The path was too perfect, too pristine. A shiver ran down his spine as the realization hit him. The ridge hadn't released him. It had merely shifted its grip, creating a new loop, a new game. The howls returned. They weren't in the distance anymore. They were inside his mind, echoing through his thoughts, relentless and unyielding. And as Tom moved deeper into the mist, the truth became clear. He wasn't free. He never would be. Story number 5. It was meant to be the perfect retreat. A weekend away from the chaos of daily life, a place where the demands of work and the distractions of city living would melt away in the serene embrace of nature. The Jackson family, David, his wife Clara, and their 2 children, Ethan and Lucy, had rented a cabin nestled deep in the mountains, far from the bustle of the world. The place was isolated, tucked away among towering pine trees, with snow-covered peaks that seemed to touch the sky. Winter had laid its icy grip over the land, painting the world in a blanket of pristine white. The cabin was rustic but charming, a cozy escape with a wood-burning stove, large windows offering panoramic views of the mountain range, and a sense of peaceful solitude that enveloped the family the moment they arrived. They spent the first day exploring the wilderness, hiking through the snow-covered forest and enjoying the brisk air. Ethan and Lucy built snowmen and had snowball fights, their laughter echoing through the stillness of the woods. Clara and David took long walks, talking about old memories and new dreams, the kind of conversations that only happen when there are no distractions, just time and the company of the ones you love. But on the second day, things began to change. It was Clara who noticed it first. They had ventured farther into the woods that day, looking for a new trail, one that was less traversed. They had wandered deep into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the snow deeper, until the world around them felt increasingly silent. There was something unnerving about the stillness, as though the very air was holding its breath. Then Clara spotted it, a small, hidden clearing beneath a dense cluster of trees. At first, she thought it was a strange rock formation, but as they stepped closer, she saw the twisted shapes that made it up. The shrine was unlike anything she had ever seen. A pile of bones, old and weathered, arranged in a crude but deliberate formation. Human bones. There were skulls with hollow eyes, ribs stacked in neat piles, and limbs woven together in patterns that looked almost ritualistic. The bones were caked in snow, but their twisted shapes were unmistakable. This was no natural occurrence. This was something crafted. "David, look at this," Clara called, her voice carrying the first hints of unease. She stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the unsettling structure with a mix of fascination and dread. David came over, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" He examined the bones, his fingers brushing the cold surfaces. "Some kind of old ritual site, maybe? It doesn't look like a burial site." "It's disturbing," Clara whispered. Her mind raced with questions. Who would do something like this? Ethan and Lucy approached, oblivious to the tension building in their parents. Ethan nudged one of the skulls with his boot, sending it rolling across the snow. "Gross! What's this? A haunted place?" Ethan laughed, his voice carrying a tone of mischief. Don't touch anything, Clara snapped, her unease growing. We need to leave. David agreed, his curiosity waning. This isn't something we want to mess with. Let's go back to the cabin. They hurried back toward the cabin, leaving the shrine behind them. The snow seemed to grow heavier as they walked, the trees closing in around them like silent watchers. That night, after a quiet dinner by the fire, the Jackson family settled into the cozy warmth of their cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and whipping the snow against the walls. The storm had intensified since they returned from the woods, and the heavy snowfall made it impossible to see beyond the cabin's front porch. The warmth of the fire and the heavy blankets felt like a cocoon, offering comfort against the cold. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept glancing out the window, expecting to see the shadows of trees dancing in the snow. But instead, the outside world was obscured in a thick curtain of white. David had fallen asleep in his armchair, and the kids were watching a movie on the cabin's old television. Clara sat by the window, her mind wandering. She tried to dismiss the unease she felt, but the image of the shrine kept returning to her thoughts. The bones, the way they had been arranged, as if someone had left them as an offering. An offering. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee mug, trying to shake the thought from her head. She glanced at David, then at the kids. They were oblivious, wrapped up in their own world. That's when she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. Footsteps, crunching in the snow. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She froze, straining to hear again. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone walking in the deep snow. But who could it be? The storm had worsened, and the cabin was miles from any other house or road. She stood up, moving silently to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she peered outside, but the snow was so thick that she could barely make out the edge of the porch. There were no figures, no footprints leading away from the cabin, just the falling snow. Clara hesitated for a moment before turning back to the fire, trying to convince herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara confided in David. I think I heard something outside, she said, her voice low. Footsteps, crunching in the snow. David frowned, setting his book down. It's probably just an animal, a deer or something. The snow makes every sound louder than it really is. I don't know. It felt different. It was deliberate. David didn't seem convinced, but he didn't dismiss her either. Instead, he suggested they check the locks on the door and windows before turning in for the night. They did so, double-checking every one of them. Everything's secure, David said with a forced smile. You're just tired. It's probably nothing. Clara didn't respond. She wasn't sure if it was nothing, but she let the matter drop, retreating to their bedroom for a restless night of sleep. The next day, a sense of foreboding still hung in the air. Clara could sense it, like an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. Ethan and Lucy were quieter than usual, and David seemed preoccupied, his mind lingering on something he wouldn't share. They all avoided talking about the shrine. That afternoon, after another brief hike into the snow-covered woods, they noticed something strange. The clearing where the shrine had been, it wasn't the same. The bones were gone. David stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening. This isn't possible. The bones were here. I saw them. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. They were just there. Where did they go? The ground was undisturbed, the snow smooth as though no one had been there at all. There were no signs, no tracks, no evidence of the ritualistic structure they had stumbled upon the day before. The feeling of unease thickened, pressing in on them. Something was wrong. Clara was sure of it. We need to go back, David said, his voice tight. Now. They didn't question him. They turned back toward the cabin, but as they walked, the air grew colder. The wind picked up again, whistling through the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispering. That night, as the storm howled outside, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, closer. It was impossible to ignore. Someone or something was out there. The footsteps were unmistakable now, There was no mistaking the slow, deliberate crunching of boots in the deep snow outside the cabin. Clara's heart raced as she stood frozen by the window, her eyes darting between the darkness and the faint glow of the lantern inside. The snowstorm outside howled relentlessly, but this sound, it wasn't just the wind. These were human footsteps. The crunching echoed in the silence, steadily growing closer, inch by inch. "David," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know how to explain the cold terror that gripped her. "There's someone out there." David, who had been sitting in the armchair reading, looked up sharply. "What do you mean? Someone's outside?" Clara didn't respond at first. She pressed her face against the cold window pane again, trying to peer through the thick snowfall. But the darkness outside was impenetrable, and all she could see was the blurry outline of the cabin porch and the thick veil of snow falling relentlessly from the sky. There was another sound, a low, guttural growl, so faint it might have been imagined. Clara jumped, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm going outside," David said suddenly, his voice grim. He stood up and grabbed his coat. "Stay here, I'll check." Clara shook her head vigorously. "David, no, you don't understand. There's something wrong out there. I heard footsteps and they weren't just human. It's like someone's hunting us." David hesitated, clearly torn. "You're just spooked. It's probably some hiker lost in the storm." Clara opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything more, she heard it. A soft scraping noise against the door, like nails dragging against wood. The sound sent chills down her spine, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow colder. David stood motionless, his eyes locked on the door. "I'm going to check." "No," Clara pleaded, her voice rising in panic. "Please don't. We need to leave. Now." But David was already moving toward the door. He opened it slowly, the creak of the wood echoing in the silent night. As the door swung open, the freezing wind rushed in, carrying with it the faintest sound, like whispering voices, distant but growing louder, beckoning. "David, don't," Clara began, but her words were cut short by a low growl. It wasn't from the wind. It wasn't from any animal Clara had ever heard. The sound was primal, guttural, inhuman. Before Clara could scream, David was out the door. The snowstorm whipped against him, blinding him as he took hesitant steps into the night, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone out there?" The wind howled louder, drowning out his voice, and the snow swirled around him, thickening like a blanket. Clara stood in the doorway, her hands shaking as she watched him disappear into the storm. Then she heard it again, closer now, right outside the door. She slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The footsteps were no longer just a sound. They were now the heavy thud of something larger, something with purpose. The growl rumbled through the night air, vibrating the very walls of the cabin. Clara's pulse raced as she backed away from the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, threatening to break free. She grabbed her phone, only to find the signal was completely gone. She cursed under her breath and turned back toward the fire. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the oppressive stillness made her feel as though she were suffocating. David didn't return. Minutes stretched into hours as Clara sat by the fire, her eyes glued to the door. The children slept soundly in the other room, unaware of the nightmare unfolding just outside. The storm outside raged, but the inside of the cabin felt like a tomb. A loud thud against the door jolted Clara upright. She gasped, her blood turning to ice. Someone or something was outside. The growling had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. The air felt thick, unnatural, as though every breath she took was harder than the last. She felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to leave, to flee. But where could she go in the middle of a storm with no way of knowing who or what was out there? Clara moved toward the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered out into the blizzard. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, figures darting between the trees. They were tall, humanoid, but their limbs seemed unnaturally long. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, burning with an unnatural yellow hue. The figures were coming closer. Clara stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to grab her children and run. But the figures outside were closing in too quickly. They were relentless, drawn to the cabin like predators to their prey. The growling began again, closer this time, a steady rumble in the air that seemed to vibrate her very bones. Then a voice broke through the silence. It was David's voice, but it wasn't right. His voice was strained, like he was struggling to speak through a thick fog. The words were distorted, twisted, as though they were being spoken by someone else entirely. Clara, Clara, you have to make the offering. The words chilled her to the bone. The offering, the shrine, the bones. It all clicked in an instant. Clara backed away from the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the phone again. Nothing. No signal. The footsteps outside grew louder, and then the door shook violently as something slammed against it with inhuman strength. Clara screamed, rushing to the back door to find it locked as well. The children were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger outside. Then the air seemed to shift. A deafening, hollow growl echoed from outside the cabin, a sound so deep, so ancient, that it seemed to resonate through the very walls. Clara stumbled backward, her heart racing in terror as she realized what was coming for them. There was no escape. Clara's mind raced for a solution, but she knew in that moment that there was no way to avoid it. They had disturbed something ancient, something that demanded a price. The bones at the shrine, they weren't just relics of an old ritual. They were offerings. Offerings to a deity that demanded blood, demanded sacrifice. The creatures outside weren't just hunters. They were servants, loyal followers of a mountain god, waiting for their next offering. Clara's only option now was to make the offering. It was the only way to save her children. The deity demanded it, and the followers would not stop until the debt was paid. Her mind raced as she tried to think of how to escape. There was no way out. She could already hear the pounding at the door, louder, more frantic now. The creatures were growing desperate. In a panic, Clara grabbed a knife from the kitchen and turned toward her children's room. The thought of sacrificing one of them filled her with sickening horror, but she knew it was the only way to survive. The god would take his offering, and the followers would leave them in peace. As she stood in the doorway, the door shattered open with an earth-shaking crash. The creatures poured into the room, their glowing eyes fixed on Clara. Their faces were twisted, human-like but with an eerie, hollow quality. Their mouths gaping wide as if to devour her very soul. Clara screamed, but before she could move, the creatures closed in on her. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. Its voice, David's voice, spoke once more. "Make the offering." The finality in those words broke Clara. She sank to her knees, her tears freezing in the cold air. She was trapped. There was no escape. She had become part of the sacrifice, her blood becoming the offering to the ancient god who watched from the mountains above. As the creatures closed in, Clara's last thought was of her children, who would never know the terror that had gripped her family. And then everything went dark. The frozen offering ends here, leaving the fate of the Jackson family sealed by the mountain deity's insatiable hunger for sacrifice. The horrors of the frozen woods continue, as the snow falls ever deeper, hiding the truth of what lurks within the wilderness. From shadowy figures to unexplained vanishings, these stories remind us that some peaks are better left unconquered. Which encounter sent chills down your spine? Let us know in the comments below. And if you crave more nightmares, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another journey into terror. Until next time, stay vigilant, because the mountains are always watching.